All right.
Are we starting?
We are starting.
Okay. Any way?
Quit monkeying with this table.
Am I supposed to sit any certain way?
No.
All right. Look at the camera. Look at you.
Look at me.
All right.
So, state your full name, please.
Vincent Robert Libbon, Jr., or actually it is Vincenzo Roberto Libonati, Jr.
Very good. So this is going to be the start of your interview process of your life. And the best always to start from the beginning. You're born in Pittsburgh, correct?
Correct.
At, how do you pronounce? Allegheny?
Allegheny.
Allegheny Hospital. And only there for a short while, is that correct?
In Pittsburgh?
Yes.
Yes.
And moved when you were a baby?
No. About 4.5.
Okay. Any memories from Pittsburgh?
My earliest memory, Pittsburgh, of course, is made up of hills. A lot of people may not know that. They think of San Francisco with its hills, but actually San Francisco only has 7 hills that it's situated on. Pittsburgh has multiple hills that it's situated on. And my relatives and family had a house that was up on a hill. And I recall at the age of 3 or maybe 4, chasing fireflies. These are these little bugs at night that light up, and you catch them in a mason jar, and you can walk around with them like a flashlight. And that's probably my earliest memory. I do recall when I was in California, so I'd have to be at least 4.5 or 5, that I had my tonsils out. Those are probably my 2 earliest memories I can recall. Standing, looking out the Marion Hospital window right before my surgery. And I can recall my mom telling me I could have all the ice cream I could eat after the tonsillectomy.
What was the view outside that window?
It was of Miller Street, one of the streets in Santa Maria. Just back in those days, it was a lot of trees and not many people.
Did your parents or sisters tell you anything about Pittsburgh or any stories when you were alive then?
Tell me any stories?
Mm-hmm.
No, we went back and visited a couple times, so I knew of Pittsburgh and Sharpsburg, where my family actually lived. A suburb of Pittsburgh, and also the homes of Hines.
Mm-hmm.
But stories, no.
Now, I think before we go on, an interesting story you've always told me is about your parents and how they met and how they had to sort of meet in secret.
Actually, yes, that's true. I'm not sure if I told you, but more likely my mama told you, because she got the details from my family and recalls them better. But the way I recall it is that they, back in those days, discriminated against different cultures, and the Italians on my dad's side and the Germans on my mom's side were, although living in the same city, were different culture, but segregated. And they met at a dance, I believe.
And even though they were both Catholic groups, there were, as you call it, 4 major Catholic groups in Sharpsburg.
Correct. And there were 4 Catholic churches in Sharpsburg. One for the Polish people, one for the German people, one for the Italian people, and one for the Irish people.
Only a small town Sharpsburg was, correct?
1,200 people.
I think that's how many people were in my high school, or my high school had more people in it.
I want to say on the record right now, but that Mama's a tough act to follow. Okay, I've got to follow Miss Detail's memory and Jabberjaws.
I got that on tape.
Oh, good.
Okay.
Don't tell someone not to look at the camera, so go.
Okay.
Okay.
So, please state your name for the camera.
My full name?
Full name.
Louise Eileen Kent Libbon.
You have 4 names.
No, my legal name right now is Louise Eileen Libbon,
Okay,
but my maiden name was Kent.
understood. So this is.
Do you want to know why my last name is Kent?
We will get into that.
Okay.
So, and that will be the first startup question, if you'd like. This is going to be the interview of your life to date, and hopefully a video record for your grandchildren to look at. So let's.
I'll live on.
Exactly. Let's start off with the first 10 years. But you were going to say something about your last name.
Because I am, as far as I know, 100% Swedish. So why the last name Kent? Because my father was a Johnson, and he legally changed his last name to Kent.
And why did he do that?
Well, my parents lived in Minneapolis. Big, huge Swedish population there. And there were 24 pages. No, I got that wrong. There was 48 pages of Johnsons in the phone book.
Mm-hmm.
And there were 24 Clifford Johnsons, which was my father's name.
Mm-hmm.
And so he wanted to have a different name. He didn't want to be another Johnson, I guess.
My actual name still is Vincenzo Roberto Libonati, and I found this out when I was leaving the college my first year, and my mother pulled out my birth certificate, and I'm not sure if it was my baptismal or confirmation certificate that the Catholic Church gives you, and I saw the name Vincenzo Roberto Libonati, and I said, well, why is that name there? And my mother relayed the following story to me about it. She said when my grandfather, Libbon, my dad's dad, came over in the early 1900s from Italy, the immigrants were discriminated against, both for finding a job and other ways. And he felt that he would have a better chance of obtaining employment if he had a more American sounding name. So he arbitrarily changed the name from Libonati to Libbon, and he never changed it legally, never went to court to do it, but from that point on, and I don't know exactly when it occurred, but sometime after the time he got over here, we were the Libbons, not the Libonatis, and my name became Vince or Vincent Robert rather than Vincenzo Roberto.
Now, how did you decide on Kent?
His father-in-law said to him, if I was changing my name, I would change it to Kent. It's easy to spell, it's easy to pronounce, and it was just an easy name.
It's Superman's alter ego last name.
Funny thing, my dad's name was Clifford, so he used to always say, that's C.J. Kent. That's C as in Clark. And people would say, is that really your name? And then he'd say, no, it's really Cliff. But he changed it to Kent, and he had 3 other brothers. There was 4 boys in his family. And 2 of them stayed Johnsons, and his other brother, Don, wanted to change his name as well. And so he decided he would, if he's going to change it, he might as well change it to Kent. So there's 2 boys named Kent and 2 boys named Johnson.
And my mom said that there was another reason perhaps why that name was changed, and she didn't know if it was true or not, but there was the rumor that their Libonati was connected with the mob at that time, and my grandfather wanted to distance himself from that. My grandfather was an interesting character as well, if I can divert for a second. He held a lot of jobs, one of them which was the constable or sheriff of Sharpsburg. And he was the bar restaurant owner. He was also a handyman and did a lot of odds and ends jobs. But at one time during a law school, I was in a constitutional law class, and in fact Mama was with me in the class that night, and we were discussing the Kefauver trials of the 50s, where the mob was being exposed, and apparently the attorney who represented the mob was a legislator from Illinois, state legislator, with the last name Libbonati, Robert Libbonati. And when this professor said that in class, Mom and I looked at each other and said, oh my gosh, the story must be true. There was at least some truth to it, that the mob was connected to the name Libbonati. So I thought that was interesting coincidence too. I have a lot of interesting coincidences in life, I guess.
Well, it wasn't just the mob in general he represented.
Yeah, he actually represented the mob, the big mobsters at these Senate hearings.
Tell him
Yeah,
your
not-
grandfather's first name.
Giuseppe? Is that what you mean?
No, it wasn't just.
Oh wait, that was Pinocchio's dad.
Prospero.
That was Geppetto.
Prospero, yeah, that was his name, Prospero.
Prospero Libbon.
And my grandmother on the Libbon side was
Mary.
Mary. Oh, this is going to be a comedy.
Just so you know, Giuseppe isn't Pinocchio's father's name, it's Geppetto,
Oh,
for
Geppetto.
those at home, in case you're confused. But I'm saying he also was the state legislator of Illinois, was also represented as the personal consigliere of Al Capone
Right, I have a picture of them sitting at a baseball park back in the...
at the Cubs
40s.
game,
How did you know that?
because it's online. You can find it very easily.
Huh.
And I'll insert it in this.
I have a picture in my my file, my photo file of it.
My mother's maiden name was Sodergren. Very Swedish name. Sodergren.
How did they both meet?
They met at the Bible Institute in Minnesota. My grandfather didn't think women should have a formal education after high school.
Your father.
My grandfather.
Grandfather.
My mother's father. He was a pastor. And he came to a conclusion, but not with the right facts. He did a lot of marriage counseling, and he saw that a lot of women that were unhappy in their marriages were educated women. And so he thought that getting an education wasn't good for a marriage. But what he didn't realize was those educated women could support themselves. So it was easier for them to break away from their husbands than it was for someone who had no training and really couldn't live without their husband's income. So he came to a conclusion, but the reason for it was wrong.
And so, because your dad was Italian and your mom was German, they weren't allowed to
Mix.
even though they're white, Catholic, all that aside, it was still taboo.
And I seem to recollect it was quite a vicious taboo. If you were even considered seeing or dating or with someone not in your culture, you were severely ridiculed, I guess would put it one way.
They were almost kind of like Romeo and Juliet.
Absolutely, there you go. Romeo and Juliet, I like that.
Right. Let's get back on track.
Okay.
They meet in Bible school, you said?
Yeah, it was the Bible Institute in Minnesota. And my father went there because he goofed off too much in high school. And he wasn't ready for college. And his mother, my grandmother, said that he needed to go there to get his act together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And they had to get married in secret, correct?
Correct. They got married in secret, and the story goes that there was only a few people present at the wedding ceremony besides my mom and dad, the priest, of course, and my dad's sister Rose and her husband. My dad was closest to his sister Rose.
And they went back to their respective houses after the ceremony.
After the wedding, they still lived separate and apart. Now, this may raise the question of how they had my oldest sister, Mary Lou, and the story goes that they had a glider couch on my mother's porch, swinging glider,
Is the window telling you something?
and they would have their more intimate relationships at night
on a
that
swinging porch.
with no one around to tell on them. Yes. My sister turned out to be really a swinging lady, too.
And of course, he did eventually graduate from college, but not until after World War II, when he was married and had 2 children. And he went back to school, University of Minnesota, on the GI Bill.
Mm-hmm. So, how many years was it before they finally moved in together after being married?
I don't know. Oh, maybe.
When she got pregnant with Mary Lou.
So, apologies to the audience. There's been a lot of interruptions from the peanut gallery of memory. But the interesting thing is there's a lot of odd and weird stories going on with your parents. They had to tell everyone after they got pregnant. After your mother got pregnant. My mother pregnant. Sometimes they say that phrase now. And so that's just more like evidence that, if you're having a baby, anything is acceptable in the Catholic Church.
Okay, I guess you could draw that conclusion. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so
it helped meld the cultures together.
Yeah.
I think that's a positive thing.
What were some of the interesting stories you just learned yourself a few seconds ago?
Well, let me say for the record that from my age of maybe 0 to 5, my recall is limited, because even though these stories were told to me, I didn't retain them because they weren't interesting to me. But my wife, Mama, had a great interest in it. She listened attentively and she remembered everything. So I've had to lean upon her for the recall of it. But what I recall is that when my mother got pregnant with my oldest sister, Mary Lou, then they, of course, had to break the news. And my dad was in, I think, his first year of law school, and he had to drop out of it to get a job and start supporting his new family. And my mom and dad moved in with my dad's family. They had a quite large house on 3rd Street, if I remember correctly. And my mom's recollection of it is that she was treated like Cinderella by the rest of my dad's sisters, no doubt because of the hangover, the cultural differences. But that's the story on that.
And where do you think your lack of interest comes from?
I think at the time, I think it's always been my nature. I'm not into drama or romance type things, or
but this is about your family.
Yeah, and just because it's my family is partly interesting, but I have never taken to those kind of stories.
And not even later in life? Not
even later, no. And partly I've been spoiled by my wife, your mother, because I know she loves that stuff, and if I ever have a question, I can always just tap into her.
So I will let the peanut gallery interject here, and you can either come into the camera or you can be a voice from off the side to retell those interesting stories.
Well, after they had to break the news that they were married because of her pregnancy, like Papa said, he had to drop out of law school, and the families were pretty accepting of it. She said her father said, well, he married a Italian boy, but he seems nice, and his father told all his friends, well, he married a German girl, but she seems nice. And after, the funny thing is after they got married, it sort of opened the floodgates for everybody else. In fact, one of Papa's mother's cousins married one of Papa's dad's brothers.
Wow, if you can follow that,
I didn't know
your
that.
Bachelor's degree.
Sounds interesting.
Yeah.
I recall that my someone told me, perhaps Mama or perhaps my mom, that she had got the pick of the litter, sort of, by the fact that my dad was a college graduate at the University of Pittsburgh and was actually in law school, and there weren't many college graduates in that small community at that time, as you might imagine. So she really had a catch.
What was his degree in?
Don't know.
The college graduate of some degree.
Yeah, he graduated from Pittsburgh to some degree. He, I'm told, played freshman basketball at University of Pittsburgh, but didn't continue in that endeavor.
Mm-hmm.
He was a golfer, if that's getting off the topic too much. Sorry.
No, that's fine.
He loved golf. His whole world centered around golf, other than his family. He had a close friend named Sheik, who I believe is my real father. Because I do not look much like my dad. My dad was very small, and my mom was a large German woman. And Sheik was always hanging around the three of them, sort of like later in life it was with me and Mama and Uncle Huey. And actually, Uncle Huey is your real father.
I don't believe that for a minute.
But anyway, yeah, my dad loved golf, and his partner was Sheik, and they would either go around and play all the courses in Pittsburgh and travel to tournaments, professional tournaments, where they were being held either a distance away, like in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, where Arnold Palmer held his tournament, or Cleveland. I know they made trips to cities to see events, play golf.
And so let's get to the important point of all this, the point of this interview, the birth of you.
Me. Okay, I was born in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I had two older brothers. They were 9.5 and almost 7 when I was born. So there was quite a bit of age difference, and I was the only girl. So they would say I was spoiled. I don't think I was spoiled, but...
And born at Swedish Hospital.
I was born at the Swedish Hospital. Actually, my parents lived in Robbinsdale, which is a suburb of Minneapolis, but the hospital was in Minneapolis. So I was born, just like you. We lived in Glendale, but you were born in Phoenix because the hospital was in Phoenix. So I was born at the Swedish Hospital, and I lived in we lived in Minnesota till I was between 18 months and 2 years old.
So not any memories, probably.
No
of
memories.
Minneapolis. Anything you learned from your brothers around about that time, their first years?
No, just from my mother that she didn't like the snow. In Minnesota especially. She always said, though, they'd have snow days and the kids would go out and play in the snow anyway, and my brothers, and they'd be out 15 minutes and have to come in and be soaking wet, and she'd have to take all their clothes off and get them redressed, and then an hour later they want to go back out again. So it was tiring for her. So then we moved to Salt Lake City.
Mm-hmm.
Because my father got a job transfer there. It was really hard on my mother because she had to leave all her friends.
How was the move on your sisters who were older than you? Do you
I
remember
don't
that
know.
one?
I was really out of touch with, mainly because of my youth. So I'm not sure how it affected them. Marilu, I guess, was close to high school age. Bernadette was 2 years older than me.
So he got transferred to Salt Lake City, and my mom had to leave all her friends. Salt Lake City still had snow, but not like Minnesota. It was more like Denver. You know, it snowed and then melted and so forth, and sometimes it didn't snow at all. And, of course, there was a Mormon population, so she felt isolated because of that, but she did have a couple Mormon friends that would sneak down to her house to have coffee with her because they weren't allowed to drink coffee in those days. But they liked coffee, so they knew if they had it with her that the people at their ward wouldn't find out about it. So she always kept those secrets.
And so moving to Santa Maria, did you move straight to Santa Maria from Pittsburgh?
Correct.
What was the reason for that?
I'll give you that answer, but let me ask you, do you want details on my mom or dad that I know historically? Is
Sure.
that important?
What details would you like to divulge?
Well, my dad and his brother Frank, my Uncle Frank, opened, I believe, a liquor store. Actually, my grandfather opened it up. And they ran a liquor store cafe for a while in Sharpsburg. And then my Uncle Frank moved out to California, specifically Santa Maria, and opened up a restaurant there called the Swiss Chalet. And he enjoyed it apparently so much that he called for his family to move out too. And my dad was, I believe, the first to follow him out there with his family, consisting of my mom, my sister Mary Lou, my next sister Bernadette, and me. And we moved out, I believe, in 1951, 52. And what prompted us to move out there was my Uncle Frank, specifically. My dad was the younger brother, and my Uncle Frank was sort of the leader of the family and the business savvy guy. And my dad easily followed his influence and moved out, which I'm glad he did. But
And your dad was somewhat the brains as being the college graduate.
yeah, he was.
Consigliere.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. But that's the reason he moved out, because Michael Frank.
And what line of work was he in?
Sales.
Mm.
He got his degree in marketing, but he never did marketing. He went right into sales. And they transferred him to Salt Lake City.
For what company?
Ooh. I want to say Insulite. They're the ones who used to make the ceilings that came in panels that had little holes in them.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if they even make those anymore. They were supposed to help with the soundproof, not soundproofing, but with echoing in a room. A lot of businesses put those in.
So, is Uncle Frank the father of Bill Libbon? The one we met who's still in Santa Maria?
No, that was my other uncle, Uncle Bill, Frank's brother. And I think Bill was in between my dad and Frank
your
age-wise.
dad was the second oldest.
Okay.
Frank was the oldest than your dad, but your grandmother spoiled your dad. It was supposed to be in the Italian families. The father and the oldest son ate first, and then everybody else ate after them. What was ever left, but somehow your dad got in on that equation. It was your dad and Frank and the father who ate first. And your mom speculated that it was because she had your grandma had a soft spot for your dad because she was in labor for 48 hours with him.
Wow.
And she almost died. And of course she didn't. She went on to have 10 children. So, but she always treated him special.
How long did you live in Salt Lake City?
Till I was 7 years old.
So you had some memories from that time.
A lot of memories from
Mm-hmm.
there. And I just finished first grade when we left. I did kindergarten and first grade at Bonneville Elementary. And I had, all my friends were Mormon. My mom tried to get me to be friends with the pastor's daughter, but I didn't like her.
Why didn't you like her?
She was a brat.
The town at that time was relatively small. I think it was maybe 12 to 15,000, which was small at that time. And our neighborhood where we had moved into, my mom bought the house on 815 North Thornburg for like $8,900, the whole house. And I say my mom bought it because she was the leader of the family and she did the papers and assertively purchased the home. It was a real nice little neighborhood that was just starting off, and so everybody was close, and I could literally at one time tell you everybody's name within that I played with within a 3-block radius, within walking distance. Those names you mentioned were my boyhood friends, the non-parochial friends. The parochial school I attended was on the other side of town, and they were a totally different group of friends. None of them really lived near me, but these boys, Greg LaRue lived around the corner from me, maybe 6 houses away. Donnie Johnson lived maybe a block away. They're all in the same neighborhood. Jimmy Stonehart, Wally Hoffman. We all hung together after school and on weekends because they were the kids that were closest to play with. But everybody knew everybody. I could, again, literally go down the street and point out houses to you and tell you who lived there at one time. Bobby McGinley and Dennis McGinley on half a block away down Thornburg. The Skunk brothers, Alan and Doug. I mentioned Jimmy Stonehart. Jimmy Oliver lived 2 blocks away. Ordell.
So my best friend was Teresa Hicks. And she was 5 days older than me. And for those 5 days, she tormented me. Like when she turned 5, she said, "I'm 5 and you're only 4." For 5 days I had to listen to that. So I thought that was funny. But she was my best friend, and she came from a large Mormon family. They were all very musically inclined, and she ended up playing for the Utah Symphony.
Greg LaRue was an interesting character, and I perhaps was closest to him because of the proximity. His dad was a math teacher. He taught us math in high school. His mom, I'm not sure what she did, but they were very educated, both of them. And they were real overly disciplined of Greg, who rebelled on the over-discipline. And we always got in a lot of trouble together. Greg ended up being, I believe, an accountant or a CPA for a bank work connected with accounting.
Did you have any extracurricular activities at that age?
No.
What did you do for fun mostly?
I went down to Teresa Hicks's house. I practically lived there. Her mother used to make all their bread homemade. And we would beg for a little piece of dough, and we were told we could play with it, but we weren't allowed to eat it because it was raw dough. But we snuck and ate it anyway. So good. That's before they had, when it was okay to eat raw eggs and whatnot.
Back in the good old days.
The good old days. Probably before we knew there was a problem, or maybe back then there wasn't a problem. I don't know. But I practically lived at her house, at least during the daytime.
I can remember of how wild I was as a kid. To give you an example of things I'd do if I was dared or challenged. I once climbed the lamppost, typical lamppost that's up, maybe 25, 30 feet from the ground. And I was dared to see if I could not only climb the post, but climb out to the end where the lamp is and touch it, and then go back down to the ground. Same way I came up, and which I did. But I think back now on that, how I could have easily slipped or fallen and ended my life that way as well. It'd be crazy if I was dared something just to do something.
And then I remember several times my father coming down to get me to go home. It was dark out, and he put me on his shoulders. And, all little girls wore a lot of dresses back then, and my dress would get caught over his head, and he'd say, "I can't see anything, I can't see anything," because I was little and he liked to entertain me. But that street seemed so long from her house to our house. We actually didn't. We lived in a duplex on the corner, and but when I went back, even I think when I was 12, we went back for a visit, and I couldn't believe that street really wasn't that big. So, but Papa and I did go back a couple years ago on a trip, and the neighborhood was still pretty much the same. Nice big park across the street. My mom liked the duplex because it had 2 big picture windows, and one of the picture windows faced the mountains. It was beautiful. He had the park across the street and then all the beautiful mountains with the snow on it.
Did you play a lot in that playground?
All the time. In fact, I got a probably concussion, what you'd consider a concussion nowadays. It had the coolest slide. You go up the slide, there was a big platform, and a slide would go down this way and a slide would go down that way. And my brothers were playing baseball in the park. And I was going down the slide. They're supposed to be watching me. In those days, so different from nowadays. You just didn't worry about kids being in the park alone. And I was only 4 or 5 years old. And I went down the slide, and I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. A baseball hit me straight on the head. And I don't remember anything except my brother Jim ran over and picked me up, and I remember when he carried me across the street, everything was spinning around. I do remember that. And I remember those were the days when doctors made house calls. Dr. Libbon.
We do now too.
And yeah, that's true. And I remember him getting on the phone and calling the doctor, and the doctor said to look at my eyes, make sure they didn't, I guess, dilate or something, and they didn't want me to go to sleep for a certain amount of time. But I could be wrong about that. I mean, that's what I remember, but it just, things like that happened all the time, and you just didn't think too much of it. You just called the doctor and did what they said, and then,
I had some close encounters myself, but it wasn't associated or similar to that story at all, no.
Tell me about those.
Well, one that comes to mind was when I was maybe 9 or 10, just walking on the sidewalk. I was walking maybe a block or two from home, and there was a man maybe 20, 30 feet in front of us edging his lawn with an electric edger at that time. At that time, it was a metal round blade with prongs on it. Anyway, I can recall walking down the sidewalk towards this guy who was edging, and he was facing me, and all of a sudden I heard a noise, and a whiz went by my head, and I literally saw it by my head, not more than an inch or two away. And after it occurred, I looked behind me, and the blade was another 20 feet sitting on the sidewalk. The blade had come off the edger and had just missed hitting me flat in the face. The man up in front was looking around, seeing what had happened, and looking at his edger and not realizing what had happened. But that was a close call. I recall that I could have ended my life so quickly.
I had all the childhood illnesses too. I think when I was 5, I had the mumps, and I had strep throat at the same time.
And it was 1957 when you were 5.
Yes, 1957.
When did you first hear about getting vaccines for those diseases?
I don't remember. I do remember, but this is further on. We lived in California. I do remember getting polio. That, not vaccines. It was a dose of prevention for polio that came in a sugar cube. I do remember that. But yeah, I had the mumps and strep throat at the same time, and I was really, really sick. But when you're that age, you don't realize how sick you are. But I remember when I came in the house one day playing, and I said to my dad, "Oh, it hurts right here behind my ears." And my dad said, "Uh-oh," because that was the first sign of mumps.
Another one was a little older. Jimmy Ordell Oliver and I were out at Point Sal, which was on the ocean about 10 miles away from Santa Maria, and we must have been sophomores in high school, maybe juniors, because we had driven out there in my car, or my dad's car, and we climbed the face of a cliff, maybe 100 feet high. We started climbing it up, and we got halfway up and realized that it was going to be too difficult. Ordell stopped maybe a third of the way up, and because of my nature, because it was a challenge, because I wanted to see if I could do something, which seemed to be a prevalent nature of mine throughout my early life, I continued climbing. I got about 2/3 of the way up, and I was stuck. I couldn't go any further. It was getting darker. The ocean and rocks were down below, and I thought, well, this is going to be the end. But somehow, over the next hour, I slowly creeped backwards down the cliffs, and I made it off. But that was closest I thought that I was going to be dead meat. I got myself into a predicament that I didn't think I could get out of.
I don't have very good looking fingernails, but if you notice, this fingernail is way larger than any of my other fingernails. And the reason for that, and it's a little crooked too, and the reason for that is because when I was about 5 or 6, I smashed this finger in an air gun. My brother had an air gun that you had to cock, and then you could shoot it, and it would shoot whatever you put in it out of it. They probably don't sell those nowadays. You could probably take somebody's eye out, just like that Christmas movie. And
Christmas Story.
Christmas Story.
Another kid that lived next to Greg LaRue, and he was a high school kid, and I was a 9 or 8-year-old, and I hated giving up in anything, and I hated being beaten severe. I just had a strong distaste to being beaten in anything, and I refused to give up on things, even to my detriment. In this particular fight, he kept pinning me down and saying, "Say uncle," or "give up," and I wouldn't do it. And I remember him pulling my arm behind my back, and again, he was high school age, maybe 16, 17, I was like 8 or 9, and Ordell standing there. I have this memory of Ordell yelling at me, "Just say give up, just say give up," and Jimmy was getting real concerned because it looked like my arm was going to break, and I still wouldn't do it, and the kid finally gave up in disgust and whacked me on the head and left into the house. But I think that's what you're talking about. It's a crazy way to get respect, but from that time on, he never bullied us again, because he knew he wasn't going to do anything except beat the heck out of me, and I wouldn't say anything. I even refused to cry. I think that was something, even when my mom was hitting me with the yardsticks and the paddles, which was dumb of me, because she continued to hit until she felt that she was getting through to me. But anyway, yeah, that's the story on, and I can't even remember his name.
And the only way I could cock the gun at that age was I'd have to put my feet on it like this, and hold it vertical, and pull the thing down. And then once I got it down, I could shoot it, because it would make a noise. You wouldn't put anything inside, it would just make a noise. So we had finished dinner, and my brothers were helping do dishes, and I was too young to help at that point, so I decided I would cock this gun. And I guess I was pulling it down with my left hand, and I had my hand right here, and I was pulling this cock down, and I didn't get it quite all the way down when it snapped out of my hand, and it went whoop, right back up and hit this finger. And talk about screaming bloody murder. Everybody turned around from the kitchen sink and were like, "What happened? What happened?" And of course I lost that fingernail. So, and then when it grew back different than all my other fingernails. So I don't know if that's interesting to anybody, but
We also had another kid in the neighborhood, Jimmy Stoneheart. His dad was the city photographer, but he had an older brother named Ricky, but we had a nickname for him. He had a nickname. They called him Jigger, and that was his high school nickname.
And I was going to say, there is no PC in this day and age.
No, not at all. And his nickname...
Politically correct, I mean, not personal computer.
Yeah. Politically correct. Jigger was his nickname, and everyone called him Jigger, and he was sort of a hood. He was, again, a sophomore, junior in high school age, and he was...
What do you mean by hood?
Well, he was a bad kid.
Mm-hmm.
He was always getting in trouble, fights or with the law or whatever, but he was a bully to us younger kids.
Not black, though.
No, but we did call him Jigger the Nigger to get him mad and then run away, and eventually when he'd catch us, he pounded us. But we were always fearful of Jigger. We tried to stay out of his way. I always remember Jigger being in the neighborhood too.
chicken pox and the measles. I think I had those both when I was in California.
Can remember our first astronaut, but I think that was 8th grade. It was like 60, wasn't it? 60, 61?
When we're talking about Alan B. Shepard or
Yeah.
John Glenn? The
Both,
first,
both,
yeah.
It was 60, 61, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was
So that was
probably
that was
even
a big
before
thing.
then, actually. A little bit before then.
Was it?
Or maybe it was right around that period.
Right around that time, I remember not being in high school, but that being a big thing, that somebody had gone out into space, that the Russians had beat us, sending a dog out in space, and then a man, and then We came
And then
after
circling the Earth, and then the first spacewalk.
them. Yeah.
But then all of our guys had their first.
It was an exciting time, a turbulent time, the 60s. It really
That was the early 60s.
Yeah. The early 60s, 62, 60, 61.
And 1957, and you were only, 5, 7 years old, not really paying attention to world events at that time, I'm guessing.
Yeah, no.
Have any recollection of anything from that time?
No.
Korean War, Eisenhower, or anything like that?
No. I did have to have a tick removed from my head, though. There was a doctor who lived in the duplex, the adjoining duplex with our duplex, and I felt this lump on my head, and I went over there, and he got it to come out with a match, lit a match, and put it next to it, and the tick came out, and he grabbed it.
Gross.
I know. Medieval medicine.
Mm-hmm. But effective.
Mm-hmm.
You were about 12 when JFK was elected. Aware of that at all? Parents talk about that?
Other than that, he was the first Catholic president. No.
With my parents being Republicans, they were voting for Nixon. Go figure. And
Vice President Nixon.
yes, and
I'm keeping checkers.
and there was all kinds of crazy stories about Kennedy, of course, and
Like what?
oh, women were just voting for him because he was good looking, and that could have been true. And he was young. He was he at that time he was the youngest president ever elected, and he had a good looking wife, a young wife that a lot of women followed her fashion. The little pill hat and the little skirt with the suit top. Oh, I had those in 8th grade.
Mm.
Yeah. And not the hat, but the outfit. And Jackie, and I remember that election, and
also he was Catholic, and your parents were Lutheran.
well, that was a big deal for the whole country, because that was the first Catholic president we had. Everyone was afraid he'd listen to the Pope and do what the Pope wanted, which I don't know where they got that idea, but
Did they vote for him?
Yes.
Because they were Catholic?
I guess they did. I don't know. I'm sure they did. I didn't.
Do we need to phone in a friend?
Yeah, if there's some story there that I'm missing, because I don't have any recollection of that at all, other than when he died.
And how in Salt Lake City? What I'll get into depth later in California in your relationship with your brothers, but anything at that time with your brothers' relationship?
oh yes, Jim had no time for either one of us. He was, even though my brothers were only 2.5 years apart, Jim was taller than normal for his age, and Tom was just the opposite. He was small for his age. So they really looked way further apart in age than they were. But Tom was the torturer and teaser, and he loved teasing me. And when my parents went out for evening, and my brothers were supposed to be babysitting me, Jim spent the evening watching TV, and the only time he got mad at us if we interrupted his TV programs. He always loved TV, and he always loved movies, and he loved reading as well. Tom was more active, doing things, fixing things. And so his favorite thing to do when my parents went out was play mad scientist.
And that happened started in Salt Lake?
Yes, that only went on in Salt Lake.
Gotcha.
I wised up when I turned 7.
Those are some funny stories. Why don't you go into them?
Well, he would play mad scientist, and he says, you can be my... He always made everything sound like it was going to be fun for me. I'll be the bad scientist, and you be my helper. Okay, because, when you're 5 and your 12-year-old brother wants you to play with him, it's like, woo. So he would mix up these god-awful concoctions, and my job was to taste them. And one time he mixed one up so badly that I said I was going to tell on him. And so
what was in that concoction?
Oh gosh, I don't know what he put in them.
Like horseradish?
I don't think he ever put anything hot like that, but like I would say vinegar and mustard and, you know, all kinds of stuff that little kids don't like. And so this one particular time I started crying and saying I was going to tell on him. And so he said, "Oh, don't tell, I'll give you a prize from my green drawers." He had this little chest about this tall with little drawers in it. And what he kept in it was stuff, because like I said, he liked to fix things and monkey with things. And so it had all kinds of stuff in it, like clock parts and stuff. So he gave me little pieces of broken chain, and he took those parts of clocks, and they're round like this with like spheres on both ends, so he'd spin them and tell me they were tops. So I just thought that was the coolest thing, so I never told on him. But then I ended up with a whole drawer full of junk when I was older and that I had to throw out. But
Mary Lou was quite a bit older than you.
Yes.
12 years.
12 years.
So how was that interrelationship with you and your sisters then, given that large age difference?
It was an interesting relationship with my sisters. Rita Del, of course, was younger than me. She didn't come along and was not born until they were in California. But as far as Marilyn was concerned, she was, of course, the big sister, but she was also physically big compared to me. She was very, very heavy and lost more weight in high school finally before she got married. But at that time, in Santa Maria at our first house, because of my nature more than hers, I was a rebellious type youth. I was prone to fighting. I went to a Catholic school.
And we'll get into that.
That they actually sent rough, mean kids to because they could be disciplined physically. But to get to your question, my relationship with Mary Lou was, I think, overall a good one, but she was much older and dominating, and I took it for a while before I physically fought back at it. And we had some knockdown, drag-out fights.
The house it had 2 bedrooms upstairs where my parents slept in one and I slept in the other. And then downstairs, the basement wasn't totally finished. It was mostly concrete. There was a washer and dryer, but it had one little corner that they had made into a bedroom. And not my parents, but whoever owned the house. And that's where my brother's bedroom was. So it was down in the basement. So this one night, we were both making haunted houses for each other. We took turns. I'd go in and do some stuff, and then take him through it. Being that age, 4 or 5, whatever I was, probably wasn't that great of a thing. So then he did a couple things, like he had a lamp over his bed, and he put a mask on it, and turned the light on and stuff like that. So then we took several turns doing this, and then he went in there, and he was in there a long, long time. And I was going, "What's going on? Come on, hurry up." Okay. So he takes me in, and he did a couple things like that with a mask. He was big into masks. He had a mask over a couple lights, and that was a little scary. And then he said, "Open the closet door." He took a tube of something. "Open the closet door." And I was like, "No, open the closet door." So I open this closet door. The vacuum cleaner comes on, and a body without a head falls out of the closet. I scream bloody murder. I couldn't even think straight. I ran out of the bedroom, ran in a big circle around the basement and up the stairs. And of course, we interrupted my brother Jim's TV, so that got him involved. Like, "What's going on? Blah, blah, blah." But yeah, I'll never forget that. That was scared the...
And it wasn't actually a body.
No, what he did was he took a bunch of brooms and stuff, and so the body would be straight up and down, and put clothes on it and stuffed it with other clothes. So, and when it not only did he turn the vacuum on at the same time, but when the body fell out, he had a light on it so I could see it. So yeah, he was basically a torturer. Yeah, but Good memories.
I can recall one, in fact, where I knew I had to get to a height advantage to have any chance, because if she got me down on the ground, because of her weight and age, I would be creamed. And I recall an instance where I climbed up on the back of a chair on the side of a doorway, and as she came through and passed by, I jumped on her back and pulled her hair down so I could get her down to the ground. Now, you're talking about maybe a 6 or 7 year old boy tackling a 14 or 15, how many years? 12, 18 or 19 year old woman. It was a crazy remembrance, but that would just show you the type of mean, rough kid I was. Undisciplined, rebellious, a product of his environment. My mom and dad both worked. We were left alone. I was sent to a real rough school where I learned more bad fighting habits, and pretty much was independent from maybe 8 or 9 years old. I would go where I wanted to and do what I wanted to.
Just for the record, Mary Lou was 10 when Bernadette was born. So it was Mary Lou, then Bernadette, and Bernadette is 2 years older than Papa, and then Rita Dell was 4 years younger than Papa. Or is, I should say.
Uncle Jim has told me stories about Uncle Tom fabricating or waking up from a nightmare and saying that there was a witch in the room. Mm-hmm. Any recollection of stuff like that you heard from upstairs? Or?
No, I never heard that. I've heard the stories though. Yeah, mm-hmm. he was he loved Dracula, but when he saw the movie Dracula, he came home and hung a cross over his bed. And he had crazy wild dreams, and I think he had poor circulation because he used to wake up screaming that bugs were crawling all over him. And it was just, he'd do that when he was awake. If he was out in the snow too long, he'd start screaming that there was bugs on him. And it was just because his legs would go to sleep or his feet would go to sleep.
And he had a wild imagination?
Yeah, and he did have a wild imagination.
I seem to have been much closer to Bernadette because of her age. I don't recall ever being physical with her or against her. We always seemed closer. Looking at early pictures of us, it was always she and I together. Until, of course, I became old enough, independent, to go do all my other stuff. But throughout my growing up, I always seemed closer to Bernadette.
You have some funny stories that you've heard, not necessarily witnessed, about him, and some of the things that he would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he always thought there was some monster in the room or under the bed, and Jim would just say, "No, there isn't, Tom. Go back to bed. Go back to sleep. No, there isn't, Tom. Just go back to sleep." They were like total opposites.
I remember you telling other stories about him being afraid of Jesus.
Oh, yes. When he was this is before I was born, when he was real little, he was afraid of any facial hair on a man. My parents had friends that came over, and my mom was out back hanging up laundry, and this friend had a full mustache, and they came in the house. I guess my father let him in. And my mom's hanging laundry outside, and she hears this blood-curdling scream coming from Tom, and she runs in the house. And all that happened was their friend looked at Tom. He was a baby, a toddler. And he said, "Hi there, Tom." And Tom saw that mustache. And so when he saw the picture of Jesus the first time, he'd scream. Every time he saw the picture of Jesus with the beard, the typical Jesus picture, he would scream. So my mom hid the picture. She took it down and put it in the closet. And so what did he do? He went and looked for it. And then my mom would hear him scream, and she'd come running, and he'd have the closet door open, and he found the picture. So one salesman came to the door once, and Tom loved to talk, and he said, "I'm afraid of Jesus, I don't know what the guy thought.
And you have some interesting stories about your dad and Uncle Frank, and I believe I'm correct in this, Uncle Frank's promiscuity.
Yeah, I know I'm not going to get this right, so I hope that voice over to the side perks up. But my Uncle Frank was definitely
A ladies' man.
thank you, a ladies' man, whereas my dad was just the opposite. He'd probably be afraid to have an affair because my mom would beat him up. But yeah, my Uncle Frank, I guess the story you're referring to, is had a stroke later in life.
Well, I mean, I'm referring to a pattern of behavior, I guess. But you can tell about that story too.
No, I can't because I don't remember it. I remember something about him having a stroke, my dad having to come over to the house and bring the woman over.
No, he brought him to the woman's house. She was a teller at the bank.
Okay.
And she invited him over, and your dad sat and watched TV while the two of them went in the bedroom. And he was in a wheelchair at the time, Uncle Frank. So it didn't stop him having a stroke.
Stop him from having an affair, no. Al Cicero was the guy who was my dad's friend and golf partner and had the record store. He was also connected, I think, with the mom because he was always going to Vegas. He and my Uncle
on
Frank,
a business trip.
they always hung together and always went to Vegas together.
Got strippers and whores and what.
Yeah. I
So
don't think quite that, but who knows?
on people's teeth.
Yeah,
You told
they
me?
had friends she had very buck teeth, and he would follow her because to him, teeth that stuck out like that were ready to come out. It was a loose tooth. So he kept. My mom was trying to shush him up, but he followed her around saying, "You're going to lose those teeth, you know. You're going to lose those teeth, you know," because he thought that they were just loose teeth, but they were unfortunately, her real teeth. And then he told the man next door he knew he was going to have a baby because he was fat. And then he started, way back when they still lived in Minnesota, she had to wash his mouth out with soap because he kept saying BM, 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 and some of the other mothers were complaining about it. And she had a big talk with him about how he shouldn't say those things, and then he did it anyway, so she had to take soap and put it in his mouth.
My Uncle Frank was a very interesting character. He played football in high school and was the big star. He and Sheik. The story goes that my dad was my Uncle Frank was the receiver, tight end, and his friend Sheik was the quarterback. There's an interesting anecdote there, if I can throw this in, that occurred later in my life in my law practice. My dad and Uncle Frank had always told me about how Sharpsburg won the Pittsburgh City title my Uncle Frank's senior year, which was a phenomenal thing because of how small they were compared to the Pittsburgh schools. And Sheik and my Uncle Frank were the heroes, but the play that worked was sort of devious, and they outlawed it since then. It's not allowed, but what happened is my Uncle Frank went out of bounds to go off the sidelines late in the game with the score tied, or they were down by a touchdown or something like that. And he didn't really go out of bounds or off the sidelines. He stayed on the field. He just looked like he was real close to the sidelines. He might have actually gone off and then came back on. And the other team, the big powerhouse from Pittsburgh, didn't realize this. And the ball was hiked. My Uncle Frank flew down the field, caught a long touchdown pass, won the game, and made history for Sharpsburg High School.
Oh, that's another thing Tom said. He was so excited to not be the youngest and have a little baby sister that my parents felt like they had to caution him that I was going to be a baby for a while and I wouldn't be able to play with him. And my dad made the mistake of saying, she won't even be able to focus on you when she first comes home. She won't be able to see you. And so as they're wheeling my mother out in the wheelchair with me in her lap, he turns to everybody in the waiting room and says, "She's blind, you know." So.
But the interesting thing is, years later in my law practice, there was a older couple that came in to have their wills done, and I found out they were from Pittsburgh area, and we started talking about it, and I told him that my family was from there, and he started getting a little bit, not mad, but grousing a little bit, saying, "Yeah, I have a bad memory about that, how my high school team I played on, high school, got beat by Sharpsburg. I had mentioned my family was from Sharpsburg, and that's what started his reaction. And he relayed the whole story that I already knew of how his team had gotten beaten. I didn't want to lose the business, so I didn't tell him that was my Uncle Frank and my dad's close friend that beat his team. But I thought that was an amazing coincidence that so many years later that story was recanted to me by someone from the other side. But anyway, sorry.
No, that was great. This is the household you grew up in, a fairly distant brother and a brother who was a combination of Dennis the Menace and Bart Simpson.
Yeah, basically.
How was your relationship with your parents at that time?
Good.
You were the youngest child by a lot?
Yes.
Were you an oops, perhaps?
No.
You were definitely planned.
Yes, my mom wanted a girl. And some of her friends even said, because she was 36 when she had me, and that was old in those days. People didn't have babies in their 30s, late 30s back then. And she had to work to get pregnant with me, and they said, well, why are you doing that? You have 2 fine boys. Why, rock the cradle? Rock the cradle. No pun intended. And she said, because I want a girl. Well, it's a good thing I turned out to be a girl.
My mom did everything. She would orchestrate us all getting up in the morning, and we had to go in shifts because our house was 3 bedrooms, the master bedroom and 2 side bedrooms. My 2 sisters were in the 1 bedroom. Marilu was out and married by that time, I believe, and I had my own little small cubby hole of a bedroom, but we only had 1 small bathroom, and we had to be woken up in shifts so that we could all use the bathroom. All of us either going to school or work had to get up approximately the same time, and I can't believe that the 5 of us orchestrated that in the house, but it was all due to my mom. She not only got us all up on schedule, got us going and got us dressed, but she would cook breakfast for all of us, including my dad. And she did that in shifts as well. And it wasn't just throw down some cereal, here's a piece of toast. She would give us whatever we wanted. She was a fabulous cook. And if I wanted pancakes that morning, she'd whip up pancakes for me. If I wanted what she used to make for me, it was a piece of bread with the center cut out via a cup and an egg put in it, egg on a bread. I think I made that for you when you were younger once. That was delicious too. But I can always remember her getting us, the family, going in the morning and getting us fed, and then going on to her own 8-hour day job as a secretary, coming home, getting the dinner fixed for all of us, and doing whatever house chores, cleaning or laundry. She was just a remarkable woman. Very tough as nails, very assertive for her time. She would have been a woman's Libbon in her time, I think, because of how assertive she was, and she took control. Perhaps it was because my dad's reluctance to do anything like that she was forced into that role, but she was definitely the leader of the family.
Well, the women's lib movement had already gotten started in the late 19th century.
True. She was a woman Libbon of Santa Maria, of our family.
Yeah.
Of her day.
Sounds like she was just more a miracle woman, superwoman.
She was very smart. She advanced in high school, skipped 2 grades, elementary school rather, and started high school 2 years younger. She never went to college, but it was because, I think, of the time and era, more so than anything else. But she was very sharp. Very clerical skills were very high too. Typed very fast. She knew shorthand. She could do it all.
So you were the youngest, desired daughter. You were imaginably very spoiled,
Well, my brothers say I was. I don't think I was, but I was. In fact, I think I was tortured in another way because I was the only girl. And I had natural curly hair, but for some reason my mother still had to put my hair in curlers. I did not like that. And she liked to dress me in these frilly dresses with these slips underneath that were scratchy, that would make your dress stand out. I guess I wasn't a girly girl back in those days, and I hated it, but she insisted I dress that way and insisted I have this curly hair. And so that was something that we didn't agree on, but being only a small child, I didn't have much choice.
My mom, I called Saint Rita. She became Saint Rita because of how benevolent she was. She would, I mentioned she was a fabulous cook, but she was better than fabulous. She got the recipes from my grandma Libbon, who was Italian, of all the Italian dishes, including pizza and bread. And she got the German recipes from her own mom, and she passed those on to Mama, who fortunately retained them. And just like herself, the sisters of my dad had no inclination or desire to cook. It was the outsider who got the recipes from the Italian grandma and continued it. And even so with today, my sisters don't cook or cook that well, but Mom did. The outsider picked up on the recipes. I thought that was always interesting similarity there. She would, my mom, cook on a monthly or maybe every 2 to 3 weeks basis, loads of bread and pizza, just like my grandfather did back in Sharpsburg, in a big outside oven. And I can recall that my job to help her was kneading the bread. And she'd always tell me, you need to be strong if you're going to be good at sports, so you got to knead this dough for me. And you did it yourself, you know how hard it is. You have to really have, you develop actually strong forearms and fists doing that. But she would make bread, she would make pizzas, she would make hot dogs in the buns, and then the neighbors and friends would come to collect on it. She'd have them all over for pizza. She'd give away bread, she'd give away pizza, just like Grandpa Libbon and Grandma Libbon used to do as well. Mama can tell you the details of Grandpa Libbon, but he literally cooked on a big outdoor oven and would do all the pizzas and bread in that oven. I don't know why I got off on that, all the nicknames.
And your relationship with your father at that time?
Oh, he was, you know, I was a daddy's little girl for sure, yeah. And he'd come home from work. I remember he'd always, I'd always run and he'd pick me up and he'd say, how's my liver? No, he'd say, how's my liver? No, I mean lover. Ah. But lover had a different connotation back in those days. You know?
Right.
So he always said funny things like that. He always said funny things, my dad. He had a lot of interesting expressions. And
Such as?
oh, he used to say all kinds of things. Like when you'd leave the house, he'd say, "Don't take any wooden nickels." I guess they made wooden nickels at one time when he was...
Well, that is an expression. That's not his.
No, but... And if I ever said so, he'd say, "So's your old man." You know. But I can't remember him right now. I'll probably remember him as we go on. But I find myself quoting him quite often. I always say, well, like my dad would say, blah, 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 blah. But now that you're putting me on the spot, I can't.
And so your relationship with your father was fairly distant in your youth. Not a very involved father at all.
Correct. He was not. He was. He left the parenting to my mom, which was, I'm sure she did the best she could given her time constraints. She was the leader of the family. My dad was just sort of along for the ride, and he had his own world. He would read his books or newspapers. He would go down in the evening time sometimes to my Uncle Frank's Swiss Chalet, and he would play golf all the time.
Which you mentioned already.
I mentioned already, yeah. His weekends were consumed at golf totally, and in the evening times he'd go down to the Swiss Chalet. My mom would join him at the Swiss Chalet at times. They had friends and relatives, of course. By that time...
and
he was a stickler for grammar?
Oh my gosh, yes. I don't remember that so much at that age, but when we lived in California, he would correct you all the time.
Well, you must have been speaking at that age and you would correct what you say.
Yeah, maybe, but I don't remember it.
Didn't learn your lesson at that age.
There were some things I definitely remember he broke me habits of. There was a time...
He broke me habits of?
Broke me habits of?
Another amazing thing you told me about your mother was when all the warnings about cigarette smoking came out, she was able to quit cold turkey without any help.
That's true. She did. I witnessed that, so I can avow to that. She was a smoker like most people were in those days, and she just decided one day that she wasn't going to smoke anymore. And a lot of people had to have aid or help on that, and often
Relapsed.
But she stopped one day, and I don't remember her smoking another cigarette again the rest of her life.
One thing I was saying a lot, and this is when we lived in California, when I was older, I was saying, a lot. I'd say something and say, blah, 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 You ever hear people do that?
Mm-hmm.
And so the way he broke me of that is every time I said, he'd say, no, I don't know. No, I don't know. No, I don't know. And it makes you realize how often you're saying it. And I quit saying it. So I thank him for that. I thank him for teaching me good grammar and for breaking me of habits like that.
I remember growing up, I mentioned that my dad was not the disciplinarian in the family, but I can recall one time that I got him so irate that he did take action towards me, although he missed. We were eating dessert, and he would always have dinner with us being my 3 sisters and my mom around the table. And I was playing with my ice cream, turning it into soup ice cream, which I like to do, which was irritating him because I was clinking my bowl, and he used to sit there like this. Mom can do it better than I can. But apparently the clinking got to him, and he told me to stop in as nicest tone as he could get, which I didn't. And I knew he was going to do something, so I was watching him out of the corner of my eye, and he all of a sudden grabbed the bowl and went to smash it in my face, and I ducked, and it splattered all over the wall. And of course, as I normally did when I got in big trouble, I disappeared outside for a couple hours until the heat cooled off, and I was out the door in seconds. But I recall that vividly because I remember seeing the shocked look on my sister's face when the ice cream splattered all over the wall. But that was about the only time I remember my dad getting involved with disciplining or anything at all.
Ice cream to the face.
Ice cream into the face, he missed.
And so you moved to California at the age of
7,
So-
after first grade.
So was that difficult for you because you were leaving things you were growing up with, or not too difficult because you weren't having many friends as well?
I had many friends, but it wasn't difficult because at that age I don't think you understand what's really going on. I remember telling a couple of my friends, well, I'm leaving, I'm moving, and you're not going to see me anymore. And they're like, okay. I don't think that we all got it. Part of the reason why my mom wanted to leave Salt Lake City was she was afraid my brother would marry a Mormon. We were Lutherans. And it's true. And he had no social life because all the social activities weren't like you have prom and dances and stuff like that. They didn't have those in the school. They were all held through the Mormon church, which, at the ward, they called them wards. And so if he wanted to go to a dance or something, it
Sounds like a hospital.
I know. It was at the Mormon ward, and so I think my mom was afraid if we stayed there he'd meet a Mormon girl because he didn't have much other choice. So when we moved after his junior year of high school, and he only spent 1 year at South Pasadena High School, but that's the high school that he is connected to.
My aunt and uncle from his side had moved out, and my Uncle Bill and his family moved out maybe 7 or 8 years later. And on my mom's side, her parents and her brothers eventually moved out to California too.
Mm-hmm.
My Uncle Frank sort of opened the floodgate for everybody to come out to Santa Maria.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one reason why my mom was anxious to get out of Salt Lake City. And a job opened in Southern California, so my parents transferred there. My dad transferred there. And another thing was, in those years when we lived in Salt Lake City, women wore hats and men wore hats. Women didn't wear hats every day, but my mother wore a hat every Sunday to church. I never remember her going to church without a hat on. And men wore kind of baggy suits then and hats. And sometimes I get other men mixed up for my dad, because with a hat on they kind of all look the same. I remember one time a guy pulled up in front of our house and got out of the car, and I said, "Daddy," and it wasn't him. So that's one thing I remember from them. But then we moved to California.
And this is back in the old days. Did you have like a milkman or stuff like that?
Oh yeah, we even had a milkman in California.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had a milkman, and the Helms Dairy truck would come around to sell pastries and breads, and ring his little bell. And
doctors made home visits. Yeah. He'd ring his little bell, and
my dad would run out to see what he had on special, or to buy something, cookies or pies or bread or whatever. And I remember one time the guy said, "Oh, I'm having $1 off on pies," and he said to my dad, "If you buy 10 of them, you'll save $10." My dad thought that was funny.
You were grade schooler through most of the 1950s, maybe the early 60s, but that era had a lot of things that we talked about with Mom that was unique to it, like milkmen and other things like that. Do you remember anything like that, unique in that era, that sort of disappeared with time?
Milkmen? No, I know my grandfather on my mom's side, my mom's dad was a milkman back in Pittsburgh or Sharpsburg.
But you didn't have that out in California?
But no, he actually started delivering milk with a horse and a cart, where they kept the milk cold with a big block of ice, and that was his profession. But when he moved out to Santa Maria, he was retired, and I don't recall the
Do you recall having milk delivered to your home when you first lived in California?
No, I don't. Maybe because I wasn't involved in it. I don't know.
Anything else from that era or time that sort of passed away with time that was unique to that time that we think about?
I'm sure there was, honey. I just have never thought about it.
The Cold War during that time. Were you there during the duck and cover period?
Oh yes. Oh yes, that was when I was younger.
Yeah.
Elementary school. And we had drills all the time, what we were supposed to do. The siren went off, you had to dive under your desk, and you had to cover your head. I guess because they thought this would protect you from radiation.
Right. The Cold War was going on at that time. Mom talked about duck and cover. Did you have that in school?
We had duck and cover, yes. That was one thing, I guess, it brings back to mind that a friend of ours, a block east of us, his dad built a bomb shelter, which was common when the Cold War was going on. And bomb shelter was something right there on your own house property, where you had a basement that was concrete enforced, and you had I recall going down there to seeing his bomb shelter, his dad's bomb shelter. You had to climb a ladder down into the concrete facility. But yeah, that was something that came and went.
And we moved, so see, if I was 7, that was 59. Second grade was in South Pasadena, and then my parents bought a home in Westminster, California, which is in Orange County. And it's the first house they owned since my birth. They owned their house in Robbinsdale. They rented in Salt Lake City, and they rented in South Pasadena for that 1 year. So I remember going down and seeing the house when it was just a wood frame, and they were saying, "This is going to be our house, and this will be your bedroom," and I just thought that was all so cool. But when we moved to Westminster, it was very rural. I have a hard time saying that word. And there was like cows across, big cow field across the street, and down the road was a peacock farm, and peacocks make a lot of noise.
It was strange because it was an interesting community with a lot of discrimination still. My high school, I can remember, was on one end of town and my home on the other, and we would.
Yeah, we'll get into that later on in the interview. But what were the major ethnicities in Santa Maria that were fighting?
Well, primarily the Hispanics and the Caucasians. They had a section of Santa Maria called Tiger Town. I was going to say you had to go through Tiger Town to get to the north side of town, and that was always an adventure.
It was a Hispanic community?
Yeah, Hispanic community. Blacks were in the minority. There weren't a lot of blacks, but there were some. It wasn't the black-white racial thing, at least at that time, in that era. For me, it was more Hispanic. Even though I had a lot of Hispanic friends, it was just interesting about this particular Tiger Town where the bad Hispanic kids would catch you if they were able to as you passed through. And I had an early job delivering papers, and I must have been 8 or 9 years old, and I had to go through Tiger Town to deliver the papers. So I was always out racing somebody to get away from getting in a fight. We always used to have a saying about the Hispanics that they would never fight one-on-one. They would always have to have 3, 4 or more before they'd get aggressive. So if you were just one-on-one, or maybe 2 of them, you were safe. But it was 3 or 4, they'd go out of their way to find you if it was just you. So it was always an adventure going through Tiger Town, growing up in Santa Maria.
It was just, it was out in the boonies. That's where Disney built Disneyland.
And when was that built?
When I was 3. We didn't live there then, but
it had already been built, though.
Yeah, it had already been built. In fact, my parents, this is backtracking a little bit, when I was 3, we were vacationing in California with my Uncle Bob and Aunt Eunice and my cousins Donna and Gary, excuse me. Greg was her husband. And we had been, the men were tired. They'd been driving and everything, and they were debating whether they should go to Disneyland or not. And they had no idea what it was going to be like, because they said, well, why don't you girls take the kids in and we'll nap out here in the car in the parking lot. They thought they'd find a big tree to park under or whatever, but that, of course, didn't happen, because when they got there and saw how grandiosos it was, and Walt Disney patted me on the head.
It was owned and operated by a very wealthy philanthropist named Alan Hancock, and he had started the company up because he loved trains, and he had literally built a railroad track between Santa Maria and the coastal town of Guadalupe, about 10 miles away. A 22-mile track, that's what it was. And he became a train engineer as well as a lot of things. He was one of the most interesting characters in my life. And he would drive the train from Guadalupe back to Santa Maria, and they'd carry produce from the Guadalupe fields back to Santa Maria and forth. And she worked for that man for 20, 30 years. As a secretary, along with maybe another 10, 15 secretaries in one room that were all doing his work. And it wasn't just the railroad work, but it was other work. He was an innovator. He developed a soil system, watering the fields, drip method that everyone caught on to and became a worldwide sensation. He was one of the wealthiest men in America. His family had owned all the land in and around Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles. His dad had actually got it. Interestingly, I had read about him in a book. I have a big book on Alan Hancock. His dad was an attorney around the 1880s, 1860s, 70s, 80s, when California was still divided into large Spanish land grants given to the Spanish people by the Spain, but California was becoming its own state, and they were taking these land grants away from these people because they said they were invalid. And Alan Hancock's father represented these people in court trying to help save their land. And they often couldn't afford to pay his fees, so they gave him land, and that's how Allan Hancock's dad obtained so much land, which wasn't, they thought, that expensive land because of its location, which was outside of downtown Los Angeles, but it developed once they found that it was replete with oil into a big oil industry in Los Angeles, all of which he and his family owned. It also held the La Brea tar pits for the historical sense, and it also was the same land that is now called the Wilshire District, Miracle Mile it's called in Los Angeles, where they have so many businesses that are so wealthy and extensive. Most of the land he gave away. He of course the family made all the, and I say he being Hancock's dad, they had 2 boys, Allan Hancock and his brother, who died at an early age. So Allan Hancock inherited all that wealthy land and oil rights and made his money that way, gave a lot of the land away. He the school I went to, University of Southern California, was all donated by Allan Hancock. He set up their marine biology program. And then he eventually moved to Santa Maria in the 50s, 40s, I guess it was. The 40s he moved and started experimenting with the strip system of irrigating farms, and that's how he started the Santa Maria Valley Railroad, and my mom started working for him.
So that was the first summer. There was some problems with, I guess, drinking fountains or something, but my parents loved it, and he was there in the park, and
you got to meet him.
Yeah, I don't remember any of that, of course, but because I was 3. But then we ended up, moving there, and he built Disneyland in the middle of a big orange field. There was nothing out there in those days. It was, everyone lived in L.A. or the beach cities. So, but of course, it grew up real fast.
I recall, as a boy growing up, he always had Christmas party for the employees, where he would play Santa Claus up on a stage, and he'd call your name as a child, and he'd go up and he'd give you a present. So I knew Allan Hancock at an early age as being Santa Claus. He was just a wonderful person, but one of the most interesting characters. He went to a school to become a captain. He actually obtained his license where he could sail a cruise ship. He had that kind of a license. He got that from San Francisco. He was a pilot. He was a train engineer. He donated 2 large boats to the USC Marine Biology. He owned a lot of the land down there by La Jolla, where the Marine Biology school was set up. Anyway.
So when we moved to California, we rented for a year, and we lived in South Pasadena. So I went to 2nd grade there, but I went to a kind of a weird school. It's called Mission Elementary. But when my mom took me over to the school to register me, they said, well, she won't be going to this school per se. She'll be going to our satellite school, because they had too many kids in kindergarten, 1st and 2nd grade. So they had a satellite school that was several blocks away that was only kindergarten, 1st and 2nd. So that's where I went to 2nd grade. So I was like the oldest kid in the school.
My bad behavior, was noticeable even as early as 5 when I attended Alvin Street Elementary School, and I was constantly getting in fights, usually initiated by me. And when I was getting close to graduating from there, they thought I should stay at Alvin Street School for another year because I had a speech impediment. And I would say, as Mom always teased me, the words, for instance, across the street would come out a-quack-a-queet. So it was quite severe, and they didn't have speech therapists at those times, but my mom thought because of my bad behavior and the fact that the nuns could discipline at that time, physically discipline you where they couldn't hit a child at elementary school. And because they held the nuns up in such high regard, she thought that I should go there and get a better schooling and get disciplined and maybe even help my speech impediment, which by the end of my first grade they had corrected and cured.
Beaten out of you.
No, not on the speech. That you got beat for bad behavior, and I didn't get beat so much as their mode of operation was whacking you on the knuckles with a hard ruler, a thick ruler.
So
Up and through elementary school, you went to a number of different schools, and when you moved to Westminster, a couple of schools at Westminster,
Yes.
what's the reason for that?
okay, when we moved there, I was starting 3rd grade, and I went to Garden Grove School. Funny little side story. It was on Trask Avenue, and so we used to say Garbage Grove School on Trash Avenue. We thought that was so clever and funny. But I went to 3rd and 4th grade there, and then they built a new elementary school, and they changed H.B. Anderson, and so they changed the lines of what kids had to go to H.B. Anderson. So I was in that area, so I had to do 5th and 6th grade at H.B. Anderson. It was a newer school.
Mm-hmm.
You know. I had my favorite teacher in 6th grade, Mr. Rusi,
Why was he your favorite teacher?
because it was the first teacher that ever talked to, that I can remember, that ever talked to us about world events. That's when the Cold War was going on, and a lot of talk about Russia and all this kind of things, and he discussed it with us.
Yeah.
And that's the first time I really had an understanding of what was going on in the outside world.
Name the names. Urbanski and history really got me interested in history. Frias was my Latin teacher, and he was also one of the basketball coaches, but I enjoyed that because of the teacher.
And what did he tell you? What do you remember?
Well, he said, the one thing that sticks out in my mind is he said that Russia said that by 1970 they would be taking over our country. And I remember him saying that. He says, so how old will you all be in 1970? 18? And, I just remember that for some reason.
Greg LaRue's dad was a superior teacher, math teacher. I can always remember one incident that he was trying to teach us a geometric principle, I think starting off the class. Was it algebra or geometry? I don't know. But he
Doesn't need to be a geometry if it was a geometric principle.
Geometric or algebraic. But I remember him walking to the back of the class with a chalk in his hand, and from the back of the class he threw the chalk up to the front and hit the chalkboard and walked up and circled it. And he started his lecture saying, now this is a dot. And from there he developed the principles, whatever we were studying. But that was the type of teacher he was. He'd come out, the first thing out of his mouth was, do you realize that in a class of 30 students or 27 students, chances are better than 50-50 that 2 people will have the same birth date? And then he'd go around and ask everybody their birth date, and sure enough there'd be 2 people in there that had the same birth date. He'd do stuff like that. He was a very innovative, ahead of his time type teacher, and a very intelligent man. He exposed me to a book at that age. Speaking of books that I exposed to you, the
Isaac
Galileo book,
Stargazer.
Stargazer, that's right. He had given it to his son to read and gave it to me after Greg read it, and I loved it so much that I got it for you when you were growing up and read it. So he was a big influence.
And then, of course, another big event I remember in 6th grade is John F. Kennedy being assassinated.
I remember that morning it happened, and where I was at school, as I'm sure a lot of people did in their lives in the United States, where they were at that moment that it occurred. But I remember the news breaking, a lot of people crying, adults crying, as well as students. It was a big thing. He was at that time, you had to live in that era to understand how much of a, not leader so much as what's the word that evades?
Figure.
Yeah, he was such a point of pride for the United States. Not only
A
was
symbol.
a symbol, maybe that's the word. He was not only articulate and a great speech maker, or giver,
Orator.
but he was very handsome, and he made you proud of being American.
Representation of the country.
Haven't felt like that since Obama became president. Proud that he was a president. But Kennedy was something special. It was a very Cold War was going on, and he acted with a lot of guts in the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's just something special about him and his whole family. They loved sports. Football was their favorite pastime. Bobby Kennedy, his younger brother, was great.
So I was in 6th grade, and we used to have our Spanish lesson on the TV. There was a local channel that there weren't many TV channels in those days, like, you know, three networks, 2 or 3 networks, and 1 local channel, 4 channels. That was it. And she had a Spanish actual class on this local channel, like, you know, mid-morning or whatever, and or maybe it was afternoon, I don't know, but all the 6th grade classes would go into the media room, and the teachers would turn it on the TV, and we'd have to repeat, you know, like she'd say, I can't even remember any Spanish now. You know, she'd say something in Spanish, and we had to repeat it, and this and that, and we filed in this one day, and sat down to watch it, and it started, and all of a sudden, because it was a regular TV station, they broke in with the news that Kennedy had been shot in Dallas.
At school, it was between classes or during classes, and I was I don't know what you call them. They call them squires and knights, and they were basically hall room monitors to make sure everybody was in class, and if they weren't in class and they were walking along the halls, you had the authority to stop them and see if they had a pass to be out of class.
Did you go to the high school of Camelot?
That's what they called them. I don't know why. Squires were the freshman kids, and you were elected or nominated. I can't even remember how you became a squire, and because of you being responsible or academically sound or whatever things they were looking for, but people that they knew could trust and could get away with monitoring hallways for kids that were sneaking out of class or not going to class.
Mm-hmm.
And I was doing that at the time. I can't remember if I was a squire or a knight. I must have been a knight at that time, and I was walking up and down the halls when the news broke.
And you know, everyone was just shocked, and we all immediately went back to our classes, and Mr. Rusi turned on the radio to listen, and we all sat there in class quietly listening to this radio, and they were saying how they rushed him to the hospital and blah blah blah, and of course we were all hoping, you know, that he didn't pass away. But then our principal came over the loudspeaker with a very shaky voice saying that our president had died, that he had been assassinated, and several people broke down and cried. I remember several girls especially crying. So that was a big event during those years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the school was canceled during the funeral thing, and
after Kennedy was John F. Kennedy was assassinated, there was no school for, I don't know, at least a couple days, at least one day, and then the weekend or whatever it was. And I remember sitting in my living room with my mom watching the whole, you know, progression with John saluting his coffin as it went by. I saw all that firsthand, you know, when it was actually happening, not in newsreels later. And
again, I just remember, my remembrance of it is a lot of people crying, and it was a little surprising to see so many adults crying over it. That was probably the biggest event in my high school career.
I'm thinking back to that year. I can see, looking back now, that I definitely had an ADD problem. I would zone out. And I remember one time specifically, I felt like I came to, and I heard the teacher saying, well, when you're done with that paper, you can go home. And I hadn't even looked at the paper. I didn't remember any of the directions, and I sort of freaked and panicked. I remember that very well. Another thing was...
You didn't think you may have had absence seizures, or the old, may have called petit mal seizures?
I don't know. I don't know.
I was into my independence, and I guess I should explain that. Unlike most kids, when I reached the age of 7 or 8, I just did what I want. I would go out at night. I'd come home without my parents knowing. I wouldn't do functions that I didn't want to do, such as my sister's wedding. I never made it to because I decided I would rather go out and play baseball, so I just left. And it's not that I wasn't disciplined for these bad behaviors. I certainly was, not only by the nuns, but by my mom. Interestingly, my dad never did any of the disciplining. It was my mom, and she broke many a yardstick or ping pong paddles on me, trying to correct my bad behavior. And that was the whole reason I was sent to St. Mary's, aside from the fact it was a Catholic church. Otherwise, I would have gone to elementary school called Robert Bruce, which was a block away from my home. But they sent me there with the hopes that the nuns would help correct my behavior.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing, too, that I backtrack a little bit, when I was in first grade and they were teaching us how to read, they dropped phonics. There was a couple-year period where they dropped phonics and taught sight reading. Well, that really hurt me. And it hurt Uncle Huey, too. We're both terrible spellers. And because of that, I had a hard time with spelling. I had a hard time with reading. And the fact that I'm pretty sure I was ADD, all that added up, that I just thought I wasn't a very smart person. But we all know that isn't true.
But yeah, sometimes you get cuffed on the head or the back of the neck if you were talking in class or goofing off like I was always doing it. But they cured the speech impediment, they got rid of it, and they didn't help with the behavior. If anything, I probably got worse the first 3-4 years of St. Mary's.
And why was that?
That was because at that time, the parents sent the hardest to handle kids to parochial school for the physical discipline, which was the thinking at that time that you needed to correct bad behavior. You needed physical discipline, which was the thought process at that time.
But I struggled in school because I was great at math because you didn't have to read to do math. Math was always my best subject, and but everything else required reading: history, English, and I struggled with all those. And it wasn't until it was my junior year of high school where I had an elective and I didn't know what to take, and my mom suggested I take shorthand because she said, well, you'll use that when you go to college to take notes, which I never did. But it was a blessing in disguise because you cannot do shorthand without knowing phonics. So I learned phonics. I only got a C in the class, and I struggled to get the C because everybody else knew phonics and had no problem learning shorthand because of that. But I didn't, and I still struggle with especially vowels, E's and I's, and is it an E or is it an I? And I'm a much better reader and speller than I was back then because I know more phonics now. But that's why I remember when I had you, I was insistent. When I went up to this Sunset School, that was one of the first questions I asked them. Do you teach phonics? Because you weren't going to a school that didn't teach phonics, because I didn't want my child to go through what I went through.
Right.
I remember my brother Tom in second grade going over my spelling words with me, and the word was disease, and I couldn't get it. And he kept saying, like ease, the word ease, it's dis-ease, Dis-ease. Well, I didn't even know how to spell ease, so how do I know how to spell dis-ease? But I still remember that.
You know how to spell it now?
Yes.
Okay.
Of course.
St. Mary's was an accumulation of a lot of kids that went there for religious reasons because their parents were Catholics and they wanted a Catholic education, but also a lot of parents sent their kids there for the ones that were unruly and wouldn't behave, hoping that the discipline, the physical discipline, would reshape them. That's why I went to parochial school, and I went there from the 1st grade to the 7th through the 7th grade.
Another thing is I experienced my first earthquake during those years too, big earthquakes, where we ended up having class out in the field because there was so much damage in the classroom. But even back then, the buildings they had certain precautions, like they had these lights that came down from the ceiling on a large pole like that, and then a light, and several of those came off the wall, but they had security chains on them so they didn't fall all the way to the ground. And windows broke in the classroom, and that's why they had us go out to the field, because they were like, well, this glass is flying.
St. Mary's playground was divided into 2 separate playgrounds. One was within the main school area, which was paved, and they held the grades 1st through 4th. But when you became a 5th grader, you went across the street to a larger playground to have your recesses and your lunchtime. And I recall you got 2 recesses, a large one in the morning and a large one in the afternoon. And of course lunchtime was a good hour and a half at least, where they'd separate the older kids by sending the older kids over to that playground. And that playground was adjacent to the large cathedral, the Catholic cathedral there. And it was dirt mixed in with rock. And yeah, there was broken glass there too.
Didn't know how many earthquakes. So you had one big one, and then you'd have all these aftershocks. And I didn't know what an earthquake was. I think I was in 3rd grade then. And when I walked home from school that day, I was convinced that our house was going to be flattened to the ground. And when I went around the corner and the house was okay, and I went in and I was so shooken up, and your grandfather just made a big joke about it. He says, yeah, I was trying to pee and I couldn't keep the pee in the toilet. Always making a joke about everything. And of course me, I didn't think that was too funny. I never did get used to earthquakes. Never. I was in a few of them. The big Selmar one, I was up at Thousand Oaks. And I was on the 3rd floor of our dorm. Not fun.
Yeah.
Maybe 6th or 7th grade where they ended up paving part of it because they had to put additional school classes there, these temporary type buildings where they held the classes.
Often would go home with bloody knuckles.
Knuckles, or more often torn pants. You had to wear parochial school clothes, corduroy pants and a pale shirt, and the buttons seemed to be at least once or twice a week. My mom would have to sew on a button or sew a rip in the pants. But yeah, that was partly from the rough and tumble games we would play on that playground, and partly because it was just a rough school to grow up in. I can recall a close friend of mine that I got to know named Bobby Crockett. And he was about a year older than I, but he was a big kid and a rough kid, and we gravitated and for some reason became close friends, and it was important that we did, because we were like 5th graders when we got to go over to the other playground, and the 7th and 8th graders the bully ones would come at you. And it seemed like in my life that because of my size and because of my aggressive nature that the older kids would pick me out to see if I needed to be knocked down a peg or two, or whatever reason I was a more attractive, probably partly because of my smart-ass attitude. But I seemed to be always getting in fights, and Bobby likewise.
We skipped over the subject, but now is a funny time to bring it up, a funny, nice interlude about how you picked up a certain word from school.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. My sexual education started in 3rd grade.
And don't worry, this is X-rated. I won't show your grandkids until they're old enough to appreciate it.
Well, it was in 3rd grade, and this one day I walked to school with a friend of mine, and one of her friends who was in 6th grade. Ooh. And they were talking about stuff, and she kept saying the F word, which I had never heard in my life.
Again, you can say that if you want.
Fuck.
And your grandchildren will want to know you're real and know the real you. You say that quite frequently.
Now, come on. And I don't say it quite frequently, but I do use it on occasion. And so it was a new word, and because I had never heard it before, I asked this 6th grader, what does that mean? And she just, she was like, she mumbled something which I didn't understand, and I didn't want to ask anymore because, she
was older than you.
Yeah, so
she obviously knew something.
Yeah, so
you don't want to seem stupid.
But I guess because it was a new word, when I came home from school that day, and my mother wasn't working then, she was a stay-at-home mom, I started saying that word like several times. And
what word is that?
Fuck. And I had to give
You can imitate yourself too, how you were.
Fuck, 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 fuck. And of course, I have to give my mom credit for being a minister's daughter and being pretty sheltered most of her life, and I never heard my parents swear. Never. They didn't say any of the words. She stayed pretty calm, I must say. And she just looked at me and she says, do you know what that word means? And I said, yeah. And she says, well, tell me what it means. And I said, well, so-and-so was saying it on the way to school, and I asked her what it meant, but I couldn't, she mumbled something, and I didn't know. So she says, okay, well, I'll tell you what it means.
I remember another fight, and this was kind of kids they get at St. Mary's, Ronnie Hazelton, who had 2 years over his class level. I think it was 6th grade then maybe, and he was really, instead of being 11, was really 13. But he was a real big kid who had gotten in a lot of juvenile problems and sent to St. Mary's for that same reason. And Ronnie was a real big kid. He was enormous compared to how I was at that age, but real mean and rough and slow. He was big and thick and slow. And he was coming after me all the time. And again, I don't recollect who started what, but I'm sure I contributed to it with my smart-ass nature and unwillingness just to succumb to superior power. And I can recall playing baseball on the field during recess, and I'd be standing on a base and he'd be coming at me because he didn't think I would move, and I'd have to steal the base or advance to the other base or just give up the base because he would be chasing me. And I got to a point with him that he was going to pound me one way or the other, so I decided to get my first lick in. And I remember the incident. We had closed from recess, and we always had to line up next to the cyclone fence to walk with the nuns back into the classroom, and we had to carry our sports equipment, and I was carrying a baseball. And he came at me while I was in line. I thought, well, it's now or never. I got to have the showdown with this guy. And I threw the ball as hard as I could and hit him right in the head and knocked him out.
Huh.
And I got in trouble for that. But
so this
and
was,
she said,
this was my first sexual education. She took that opportunity to have a talk with me about what men and women do. And of course, as any third grader, I was grossed out. And I don't think she went into specifics, but she basically said, I think she said something like, when men and women sleep together, that was her term, they do this and it can result in a baby. So in my mind, I thought just sleeping together in the same bed. Because at another time she said, well, they can't sleep in the same bed because they're not married. What does that have to do with anything? Well, when you get married and you sleep together, then you can make a baby. So in my mind, it was sleeping together in the same bed that made a baby. a couple years after that. I remember playing house and saying, "Oh no, they can't sleep in the same bed. They're not married. They'll make a baby." My friends' mothers probably were aghast. But anyway, so my mom was very open with me about sex, and if I had any questions, or she would talk about it anyway. A lot of times she told me once that when the boys were growing up, they always told them, wait till they ask questions, wait till they ask questions. Well, Jim never asked questions. And so one day she thought, well, I need to sit down and talk to both the boys separately. So she talked to Jim, and when she started talking to him, he was like, yeah, I know all about this. I've heard all about this from my friends, blah, blah, blah. So then she sat Tom down and told him the facts of life. And when she was all done, he said, oh. But with her and I, we had a lot of, she talked to me about a lot of things, sexual wise. But she thought, you should be married before you had sex, which I didn't abide by.
And we'll get into that in another session.
Okay.
The big trouble I got into was later that next day after school, because the word spread around Ronnie Hazelton was going to beat the crap out of me. And I knew he was going to get me sooner or later, so I decided I'd better just face the fight and get it over with. And that was another close call, because the fight lasted for a good 15 minutes, with me winning the first 10 to 12 minutes of it by running around Ronnie and kicking him in the back, or jumping on his hair and pulling it like I did my sister, and then jumping away and running away. He was so slow moving I could continue to outmaneuver him, but he finally caught me. And he was so much stronger than me, he threw me down to the ground, and I recall right before I passed out him pounding my head against the curb. And fortunately the nun came up finally after about 10 to 15 minutes of fighting and broke it up. And I was close to getting knocked out, I remember at that time. But interestingly, after that fight, he and I became good friends. And we hung around. I'd go over to his house, Bobby Crockett and I and him, and he all of a sudden thought I was a nice guy, because I guess I stood up to him and nobody else did. And I remember in high school, Ronnie was killed at a dance, at an adult dance that he apparently went to. He got into a knife fight and got stabbed and killed. I remember him dying when I was in high school, but that's Ronnie Hazelton.
There weren't a lot of young adult books probably in that
Yeah,
time. But there were adventure stories.
I do remember reading a couple books during that age. I remember, and I can't remember the name of it, but it was about a kid who lost his sight. And I was probably in 5th or 6th grade when I read that. And the kid was, he was a normal kid, and he had like the kids played with firecrackers or something, and it blinded him.
Oh yeah, I know what story you're talking about.
Yeah, I think every kid.
I can't think of the name.
Yeah, and the kid had to, at first he was resentful and he fought everything, and getting ice. Then he finally got an eyesight. What do you call it?
Seeing eye dog.
Seeing eye dog. Thank you. And he fought that at first, and then maybe that's where one of my loves for dogs came about. But then he finally embraced that, and blah blah blah.
Yeah, I enjoyed reading all the time, and I was influenced by one of our English teachers who really emphasized reading. I can't recite the names of the books that I read, but I read all the classics. He was big into the classics.
Like Fitzgerald's, Hemingway, that sort of.
Not just the Americans, Fitzgerald's British, but yeah, even the Dickinson, those kind of books that were big during history.
Booker T. Washington. I knew all about Booker T. Washington because I had to read the book and I had to do a report on it. Do you know who Booker T. Washington is?
Why don't you enlighten us?
I don't know if I remember. He was born a slave, but he, like the saying goes, pulled himself up by his bootstraps.
Yes.
And became, I don't remember what he became. But I do remember that. Booker T. Washington. We were assigned different people, and that's who I got assigned. But, you know, I learned all about him, and because of that, a little bit about, you know, that era. So,
was the Redford and Groves published by that time?
I don't know if it was. I didn't read it.
So, but you remember Booker T. Washington? You remember a story about a kid going blind?
Going blind. My dad read to me a lot when I was younger. Now we know better. Now we know that you should read to kids like we did with you your whole life practically, especially your father read to you. I mean, you guys read books out loud into junior high. Because it's a good listening skill. But what my father liked to do was he liked to read me to sleep. And so I knew the stories backwards and forwards, so he would change them a little bit. And if he didn't get a response out of me, he knew I was asleep. Because if I was awake, I would say, "That's not how the story goes. That's not," and he'd say, "What do you mean that's not how it goes?" You know, and he always made a joke about everything, but so that's how he would test. If I didn't say anything, he knew I was asleep, and then he could tiptoe out of the room. I don't ever remember my mother reading to me, but my father read to me a lot.
I think I found the name of that book, Follow My Leader.
Yes. Yeah, that's the first book that I can remember reading by myself. So,
comic books. I was big into comic books. I loved Mad Magazine. I had a great Mad Magazine collection that my mom threw out when I went away to college without asking me. Similar to what happened to Howard Stern. Did you ever hear that story?
About his Superman comics.
Yeah. Mine was Mad Magazine. But
what superhero comics did you read?
Primarily Superman, Flash. I think Flash was my favorite because he was so fast. I had some, but not the extensive collection that some people have. But Mad Magazine was my big collection, which disappeared.
Did your parents make you read at all, or do anything educationally active at all?
Religious-wise, my mother made us have what she called, people in those days called devotions, every night after dinner. The church had a little pamphlet that every day, I don't know how often it came out, she'd pick it up at church, and it was maybe for a month or something, let's say, and every night it had a different little story, and then there was a Bible verse connected to it. So we'd have to read the little story and then read the Bible verse. And that was every night. And we always prayed before we had a meal. My mother was a pastor's kid. They used to call PK. So this she instilled in us. But my brother Tom never seemed to mind. Jim he bucked the system a lot more than Tom did. Tom always did what he was told, and Jim always fought everything. And I remember finishing dinner and my brother trying to get up to leave, and my mom would say, "Wait, we got to have devotions first," and Jim would go, "Ugh," like that. This was almost every night. But because of my lack of phonics, I was a terrible reader. But she made us take turns reading. I didn't read, they probably read more than I did, but when it was my turn to read, my brother Jim had no patience for it because he wanted to get on to what he was doing, and I would take forever to get through the little story, and he would just be sitting there going, "Oh my gosh." So I do remember that.
I thought it was interesting that I went to church a lot. Monday through Friday when we went to school, we being my sister Bernadette and I, would either ride our bikes to school, which again was across town. It would take us maybe 20 to 30 minutes to ride across town, or my mom would drop us off at school in the morning. But we would always be there by 8 o'clock when church services started. And they'd always have a mass every day from 8 to 8:45, and then school started at 9. So Monday through Friday, and Sunday, I went to Mass. That's what the Catholic service was called. And I did the calculations once for that many years, and it's an amazing amount of Masses that I attended to, which is interesting because I was such a bad kid.
Were they all in Latin, or did they have other languages?
That's interesting because they were in Latin, and I enjoyed Latin. I really did the I don't know, romantic part of it. Not romantic, but it was just neat that they spoke a different language. And later, maybe my first year of college, the Catholic Church went away from that, and they started holding English services. And I thought they went backwards because they had such a beautiful service in Latin. But I thought it was interesting that I attended so many Masses, that I was physically disciplined by the sisters, and I still was a bad kid.
Yes, Debbie Bennett was my best girlfriend from, I think, 3rd grade through 6th grade. They moved after 6th grade. They moved to Missouri, back to Missouri, where her parents were from. The interesting thing about Debbie Bennett was her mother was only 5 years older. Let me think this through. It was 10. Was only 5 years older than my oldest brother, because she was 15 when she had Debbie. And see, my brother was almost 10 when I was born. And I remember that just blew my mind. But she seemed so much older because she was married, and Debbie, because she had Debbie when she was 15, Debbie's siblings were way younger. Because, you know, when you have a kid at 15, you don't have a bunch of, most people don't have a bunch of babies right away. So they waited to have the other, did she have 2 or 3 siblings? She either had 2 or 3 siblings.
Bobby was an interesting character because his mom was a Hollywood actress when she was a child. She was actually one of the characters in the early Little Rascal shows, which was a cartoon shows in the 50s and 40s that they made.
What character was she?
She was Mary.
Oh, okay.
And I remember going up to Bobby's house and seeing the plaques and the information about her.
So when we were, during that time, especially 5th and 6th grade, our favorite thing was Friday night. Her parents went bowling, and we babysat. But we didn't really have any interaction with the kids because they were so little that they were already in bed by the time I came over. But our night consisted of watching a whole string of shows. I remember one of them being the Flintstones. You can imagine Friday night, most of the shows at that time were geared for younger kids because everybody else goes out on Friday nights.
Were the Jetsons on at that time?
The Jetsons, yeah, the Jetsons.
Yogi Bear, all the Hanna-Barbera cartoons.
Yes. It was like a
Huckleberry
one
Hound
one right after the other. And while we had those on, we played games. We played the Barbie game. We played, what were some of the other games we played? I remember the Barbie game. We played Clue. We played, I don't remember all of them. I just remember the Barbie game because it's so funny to me now that you had to go around the board and you had to collect a date, a dress, something else, and get to the prom, the first one to the prom with all the things won.
High school Barbie game.
Yeah. And one of you wanted the cutest boy. There were cards and there were a bunch of boys and you wanted the cutest one, but one of them that was
Poindexter.
Did I tell you this already?
No, I just know that.
You know that. And Poindexter was the nerd, but you took him if you had to, to get the card to make it because you had to have the dress, the date, and I don't know, I can't remember what else before you could go home to the prom, the end of the game.
And Poindexter looked like...
He had red hair and glasses and, the stereotypical dork back in those days, Now, kind of like Ed Sheeran now. Except Ed Sheeran doesn't wear glasses.
But Bobby, like I said, was a big kid, and I remember one incident that was very vivid in my mind where we were surrounded by 7th and 8th graders. We were 5th graders. and we were near the bike rack, and they were all coming there, maybe 10 of them, 8 to 10 of them were going to pounce on us and warranted or not, beat the living crap out of us. And I remember we got bats, and Bobby and I were literally a bat distance apart, swinging the bats and keeping our distance as they kept trying to attack us, and we'd be hitting them. And, I mean, it was pretty rough, but it lasted for about 5 minutes, that fight, before the sisters came and broke it up.
Now, do you ever remember a time before TV, or had that been pretty well established?
No, TV was already invented when I came along.
I know it was invented, but wasn't necessarily widespread.
No, when I remember coming home from church, this was back in Salt Lake City, I remember coming back from church and watching Heckle and Jekyll. Heckle and Jekyll were two minor birds. It was a cartoon. And I loved that for some reason. But I don't remember Howdy Doody that well. My brothers remember Howdy Doody. I remember the Mickey Mouse Club, but I wasn't a fan. I liked cartoons. I didn't like hearing kids with ears on their heads singing. That didn't do anything for me. So, but...
Did you watch a lot of TV?
No. There wasn't a lot of TV to watch.
How much a day on average would you watch?
I think Heckle and Jekyll on Sundays.
And you were very active in sports, multiple sports from an early age, mostly baseball, football, and basketball. Anything else?
Golf. Swimming. Yeah, I played all the sports.
Tennis? Or no?
Tennis, yeah. Jimmy and I used to go to the park right next to his house, and they had tennis courts there, and we'd play, and I can remember spending a lot of time just hitting the tennis ball up against the backboard, refining my stroke and getting better at it.
Now, if you're talking later on, I discovered I Love Lucy.
Well, how old were you when you discovered that?
Probably 5th or 6th grade. But it was on during the day, so I only got to see it if I was homesick or something. It was on 9 a.m. in the morning.
And you enjoyed it.
I loved it. Loved it. I still like it.
Right, yeah, but I mean, it spans ages, definitely.
Yeah. It was very funny. And it's funny on all levels for a kid and for an adult, too, because she was such a physical comedian that a child would laugh at that, where, you know, the other verbal, like, if so to speak,
higher level
comedy would appeal to the adult. So it was well liked by everyone, I think.
Golf, of course, because of my dad. He used to drop me off at the golf course sometimes on his way to work, and pick me up when he left work, and expected me to be playing golf that whole time, which a lot of times I did. And a lot of times I just went out to Jimmy Adams' ranch or goofed off doing other stuff.
You know, we didn't watch a lot of TV during the week, except during those years. I remember my brothers and my father loved Soupy Sales, and they used to mimic him because he had these hand puppets that he would, I don't know, this one would go oh, 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 or something like that, and they'd do that to each other. And so I was at that age where I didn't really watch it, but I heard a lot about it because of them laughing and joking and stuff about it.
Swimming, we had what was called back in those days a plunge municipal pool that was covered, and I recall getting my early swimming lessons there, and involved in swimming quite a bit. I enjoyed swimming.
Did you want to, or did your mother insist you have swimming lessons, or how did that come about?
No, it was just she got me involved because it was free.
Oh, okay.
The city put it on, so she gave me the lessons that way. I never had any tennis lessons.
Soccer?
I never had any golf lessons. Soccer was unheard of, and perhaps was played by some of the Hispanics, but we didn't have a soccer team in high school, and there was no organized soccer games that I even know of. Baseball, basketball, and football were the three big ones.
Did you own Barbie dolls? You even have some collector's edition.
Yes,
still
I do. I still have
packaging.
it's not in the original packaging, but I do have the original Barbie doll, and I still have it. I probably should sell it. It's probably worth a fortune.
Did you play a lot with that?
Yes. I probably got my first Barbie doll in 4th or 5th grade, and then Ken doll came out. And my girlfriend and I both had a Ken and a Barbie, and we'd play house or whatever you want to call it with Barbie and Ken. And I think I eventually got the pink convertible, and we had Barbie's house. No, we made our own house. My mother had a ton of scarves. She had like probably 50 to 100 scarves. Those were big, those little scarves that women in the 50s wore around their neck. But she didn't wear them anymore. It was the 60s, and they kind of got out of style. But, you know, Grandma never threw anything away. So we use those scarves to make couches and beds. But I'll tell you something. When we started learning more about sex, Ken and Barbie did more than just fix each other's food.
They slept in the same bed
They
together.
slept in the same bed.
What were we talking about? Oh yeah, the incident why I left parochial school. They had this large area that we played on, and baseball was the big sport, and we would play in the corner of the field, so that left field was the cathedral, which is a good poke, maybe 200-300 feet away. And we played with softballs then, not hardballs. And I remember during recess, I was a pretty good baseball player, and I could hit the ball pretty hard. I hit one so hard that it went up to the second tier of the cathedral and just missed the window.
The stained glass window.
The stained glass window, which I was told afterward cost a couple $1,000s, which I thought was, God, more than I'd make in a lifetime. But I did it, unfortunately, while the Monsignor, head of the church, was standing outside at recess, and he saw it all happen. And he about had a heart attack. I remember him coming running onto the field, screaming at the nun and saying, "Don't let those boys play baseball," blah, blah, blah. So we were forced to change our field so that we then were hitting left field. To me, was out into the neighborhood. And again, it was even a little further poke, 300 feet maybe. And I broke a neighbor's shingle off her roof, or put a damage to the roof with a couple long home runs. And this occurred over a period of a couple of weeks, so the nuns changed the diamond round again to allow us to continue playing baseball.
All because of you.
All because of me. And this time I was facing the
Left field was.
Pardon me, left field was the younger school, where the younger kids played, the actual school grounds. And I broke the 4th grade window within the first day, and that was it.
And I remember being in 5th grade in particular, and there was I mean, this wasn't the whole 5th grade, but there was a time, an era in 5th grade when girls would sit, because they were starting to show us those films about having your period, and the boys went and played baseball and with a male teacher, and we'd have to watch these movies about, you know, how you could still swim and do certain things when you're on your period, but it was like how your body's changing and all this kind of stuff. The boys always wanted to know what was going on, what we were watching. Of course, we never told, but because of that, I think we were more interested in sex, and our bodies were changing too. And I remember sitting in a circle at lunch and talking about sex with all girls, and then what friend was it? I think it was Sandy Jordan. She was babysitting, so this might have been when we were in 6th grade, because she would have had to have been older to babysit. And she called me with the news. She was babysitting, and she called me with the news that she had found out that for a man and woman to have sex, the man had to be hard.
The next day, my mom got a message from the superior, Mother Superior, they called her, and I remember her name, Clemencia. And naturally, just my mom and I went down. My dad wouldn't have anything to do with that and wasn't involved with me at the time. And I remember sitting in the little rectory where the sisters all lived next to the school. And Mother Clemencia laid it out to my mom that they can't allow Vincent to play baseball anymore because he did too much damage. And she recalled all the damage to my mom. And my mom sat there the whole time, and she said, Vincent either has to quit playing baseball or no longer attend St. Mary's. And my mom looked at me, and I remember saying, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "I want to play baseball." That was my last year.
That was a real, what? It gets hard? So that was like, ooh, you know, there was a lot of that going on. And then in 6th grade, we had Mr. Rusi, and we had a female teacher. The other class was a female teacher, and so she stayed with us to watch the movie. Mr. Rusi took the boys out to play baseball. And I remember one of the girls asking, is there anything that boys have that's similar to us starting menstruation? And she said, well, they have something called a wet dream. Well, what's that all about? Well, she says, you probably should discuss it with your parents. Okay, I got to find out what this wet dream is. So it was during the time my mother was taking shorthand classes, so she wasn't home a lot in the evening. She wanted to be an elementary school secretary, and you had to have shorthand to do that. So she was going to night school and working during the day, so she wasn't around a lot. So I decided I would ask my brother Tom. So I go up to him and I said, what's a wet dream? Well, his face turned white as a sheet. And he sort of stammered around and he said, I think you ought to ask Mom about that. And I said, oh, okay. Must be something awesome. But yeah, so I remember that distinctly. But then, you know, I asked my mom about it and she told me. You know.
And then you went to El Camino
St.
Junior
Mary's.
High for
And I went to-
8th grade.
Correct. I went to El Camino, which was across the street from my house. It was a wonderful school as far as how it was laid out. Had a lot of childhood memories from El Camino. Most importantly because of the hedge. I don't know if I ever told you
Yes,
this,
you told me about the hedge.
but they had a hedge that was maybe 10 to 15 feet high, depending on what part of it was. No, more than 10, maybe 12 to 15 feet high. And it was thick, anywhere from 3 to 6 feet wide. And you could literally climb inside the hedge and on top of the hedge. And we'd spend a lot of our youth climbing the hedge and trying to see how far we could walk on top of the hedge and being attacked by birds that had their nest up in the hedge.
Oh, I went steady in 6th grade, but I don't think we hardly ever talked to each other. It was like I told my friends I thought he was cute, and you know, they told him or they told some of his friends, and then he gave them a ring to give to me of some cheap little, you know.
Uh-huh.
And then so I wore the ring for a while, and then I don't know, we went steady for maybe a month.
And what does that entail?
Like I said, we hardly even talk to each other. It's just you're trying to emulate teenagers, and you know you're just a kid and you think you're older than you really are, and so then after about a month he came and told me that his parents found out and he had to break up with me. So I said okay.
But El Camino was unique because it had such a large grass field, and it was readily accessible back then. They didn't lock the schools up like they do now. And the field was totally grass, maybe half of the whole school. And then the other half was the classrooms and basketball courts. But the grass portion was at least 120 yards one way and maybe 300 to 400 yards the other way. It was just immense, which again for a boy who enjoyed sports so much was like heaven.
Mm-hmm.
They had baseball fields there that you could actually have left field being the hedge. And there was a popular professional game at the time called Home Run Derby, where they would take the best professional baseball players, could hit home runs and see how many home runs they could hit. Whoever hit the most home runs won. And you just have nice lobbing, pitching, any kind of pitch you wanted. And we started playing Home Run Derby with the hedge being the left field that you had to hit it over. We being Jimmy, Ordell, Oliver, and several of the other kids. And we always had so much fun playing Home Run Derby in that place. Not to mention football and basketball on the courts. Wonderful time at El Camino. I loved the fields. We enjoyed it from age 7, 6 up until 8th grade when we left.
It was a lot of good memories.
Yeah, and it's so great that it was a time you could do that without fear of, sexual predators, other things like that,
Yeah.
of that nature.
Yeah. No, you never thought about stuff like that back then. I mean, I'm sure they were around, but I don't know. Going back to that, when I lived in South Pasadena in 2nd grade, oh my gosh, a group of us used to walk to the Rialto Theater to watch the Saturday morning matinee. No adults. There'd be about 3, 4, 5 of us kids. And we walked to the show. My mom would give me 50 cents. And for that I could get into the show. I think it was $0.25 to get in. And I could get a candy and a popcorn and a Coke with the other 25 cents. It was great. Watch some movie and walk home. And then there was a park. In fact, I recently showed Papa the park. And we used to go there by ourselves all the time. And I look at it now and there's all these bushes and there could have been anybody waiting, lurking.
The bushes, the bush animal.
Yeah, and you just didn't think of stuff like that back then. No one worried about any of that stuff because we weren't aware. I'm sure there was predators around, but I don't think people just got that way in later years.
Yeah.
We just know more about it. We were just lucky, fortunate. So, but yeah, I digress.
Jimmy Adams was a parochial classmate, and I became close with him at St. Mary's, and even closer during a certain period of my time, maybe ages 8 to 11, because his family had a large ranch and farm area, maybe 3 or 4 miles west of Santa Maria on the way to Guadalupe, off of Main Street, and it was a very large ranch farming area where his dad actually had a separate housing for all of the immigrant workers who were all Japanese, interestingly, and literally from Japan. We used to go in their little house, dormitory, whatever you want to call it, and walked through, and of course they all knew Jimmy as the boss's son, so they were all friendly to him, but hardly anyone spoke English. I remember that.
You like to perform skits when you're...
Oh yes, I forgot about that too. I was very into the sound of, not the Sound of Music.
South Pacific?
South Pacific.
Just specifically that.
Well, see, part of it was my parents had friends called Virginia and Eric, who coincidentally lived in all the same states and moved about the same time as my parents did. They were from Minneapolis, they lived in Utah, and then they moved to Southern California too. Not the same years, but pretty close. They were the couple that always came over and played, when we lived in Salt Lake City, always came over Friday night and played bridge with my parents. And my mom would set up the card table with a little card table tablecloth and have little snacks and little drinks, and they play bridge. And I forgot why I was telling you about Virginia.
You're performing South Pacific.
Oh, and she had a niece named Christine who was she had a mad crush on my brother Tom. So she was probably maybe 4 years older than me, but when you're that age, that's a big difference. And I was in awe of her. And she taught me the dance. The one that...
Honey Bun,
that Mitzi Gaynor did in the movie. And I knew because she had memorized all the dance moves and the hand moves and the, everything with the song. So, I learned that from her, and I would do it in my bedroom.
The interesting thing about Jimmy Adams, though, was the fact that he had horses at his place and jeeps and guns. And at a very early age, we, again during this time, maybe 8 to 11, would ride horses. And within a year or so, we started driving the Jeep. I don't say we, Jimmy was allowed to drive the Jeep.
How old were you? You would sing it as well?
Yeah. I had a sailor hat. I put a sailor hat on, one of those little white sailor hats. And I had all the movements down. I'd sing the song.
And you'd have like a record player?
Record player going. Yeah, record player going. And in fact, funny story, like I said, I never heard my parents swear. And the one song that the sailors sing, Nothing Like a Dame, the word damn's in there. And I was in my bedroom once singing that song. I had to be, we lived in Southern California, so I was at least in third grade. I was at least in third grade, but I was probably older than that. And I was singing that song and singing the word damn because I didn't really know what it meant. And my father came in and stuck his head in and he said, maybe when you sing that song, you shouldn't sing that particular word. And I was like, why? And he said, because that's sort of a tough word that sailors use. That was his explanation. And I said, okay, that was good enough for me. So I did. Another thing I did was I'd make up my own musicals with different music. Like, and it was always, boy meets girl, boy falls in love with girl, couple breaks up, they break up, he's heartbroken, and I do the songs accordingly. Like,
so you like took songs from musicals and
not even musicals.
Oh, like pop music.
Like Frank Sinatra. What song in particular did I use with him? Oh shoot, it was on the tip of my tongue. There was one that I used like when he was falling in love, and then I'd sing that song. And then I remember, I distinctly remember that, and then She's a Devil in Disguise by Elvis. That was part of my storytelling, because that was when he realized that she cheated on him or something, She's a devil in disguise. Oh, yes, she is. And then they break up, and then Frank Sinatra's song, Where Are You? How Can I Live Without You? That song. And then they get back together, and then I don't remember what song I sing for that, but I had my own little story.
You had the original idea for that, for what they do for like Mamma Mia and Moving Out, and
I was way ahead of my time.
Yeah, you had the game plan for that.
Mm-hmm. If I could only really sing, I'd be okay. But I could sing along with the.
Or had the connections to be a producer.
Yeah, maybe that's what I should have been, a producer instead of the performer.
I was between the ages maybe of 8.5 to maybe about 11 when Jimmy and I hung out a lot. I would literally walk or ride my bike to his ranch farm area and stay there the whole day, sometimes overnight. But we would ride horses to the riverbed, which was maybe another 3 or 4 miles from Jimmy's house, and take 22 rifles with us and shoot at squirrels or anything that moved out there. We were crazy, I guess we could do that. And I'm not sure whether Jimmy did it without breaking the rules of his dad or not, but I sense that he was allowed to do that because his dad would know that he had taken the Jeep.
But I loved all that, but I never pursued it outside of my bedroom. Although I was in the talent show 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. And you could only be in the talent show in 4th, 5th, and 6th grade in elementary. But I probably wouldn't have done it on my own, but I had friends that were also creative. And so they'd always say, come on, let's do this for the talent show. So I'd go along. In 4th grade, we sang My Grandfather's Clock. You know that song? We sang that. In 5th grade, we sang A Hobo's Life. A hobo's life is a happy life. He's got no family, got no wife. He don't pay any income tax, and he just because he just relax, something like that. Boom, 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 boom. I mean, we had the whole choreography. We dressed like bums, hobos. We didn't call them bums in those days, and so we did that routine. And then my 6th grade year, we did I Love Being a Girl, that song.
I Enjoy Being a Girl?
I Enjoy Being a Girl.
From Gigi?
Yes. So those were the 3. And I just had friends that were probably more talented than me, and I just went along.
Yeah, I remember one particular story where you got embarrassed performing in your room once.
Yes. My brother had a friend named Terry Benz, he was actually a couple years younger than my brother, so he was like maybe 5 years older than me, and I had a mad crush on him. And I was doing the sailor song from South Pacific.
Honey Bun.
Honey Bun, thank you. And they were peeking at me. They had the door open and were peeking. And when I turned around and saw them there, I wanted to die. I wanted to crawl underneath the bed and never come out again. They were laughing. Yeah, that was embarrassing.
I can picture Tom's laugh right now.
So, anyway.
Between fields of produce.
Mm-hmm.
But I recall that as like I was at Tom Sawyer's Island. It was so much fun for a boy my age to be able to ride horses, actually play like cowboys instead of, be a cowboy rather than just play it. We had the guns, we had the horses, we just did what we wanted, and it was some of the funnest times I can remember as a youth, although I had so many fun times. But,
a person I left out of my childhood now, because I didn't really put it down on my outline, who...
You can say it now, go ahead. No repercussions.
Who was a big part of my childhood and my whole life was my cousin Donna.
Mm-hmm. That's free to talk about her now.
That it made me think of it when I said that, because her and I had some crazy stuff too.
Mm-hmm.
When we were really young, she lived in New York and I lived in California, but we'd spend summers, our families would vacation together, and we'd spend summers together quite often. And we went to Vegas. My parents took us to Vegas a lot, and it was in Vegas where we learned where we played a game called Bare Naked Lady.
Before the Bare Naked Lady.
Yes, they stole our name. We were probably...
They stole your name?
Yeah, they stole our name.
I can recall, not on that topic, but that brings the topic over the next, that on that very block next to this kid who had the bomb shelter, I can't remember his name, lived the Ostinis. He was another neighborhood kid of mine,
Mm-hmm.
a friend of mine. Billy was a year younger than me. He had a brother named Terry, and then a younger sister. And his mom, Natalie, was the best female bowler in town. Bowling was a big thing too, going back to the sports. We had the bowling alley, Rancho Bowl. Billy Ostini we became close for a small period of time, a couple of years when we played Little League together. He and I were on the same team, and he was a good baseball player. But he got roly-poly, and when we got to high school age, he was probably not physically able to play anymore because of his size.
We were probably only like 4 and 6. She was 2 years older than I was. The Bare Naked Lady game went like this. Our parents were out at the casinos, and our brothers were in charge of us, and all they did was sit and watch TV, and we'd play all these crazy games. Like, we'd use the closet that had sliding closet doors, so we'd pretend like it was an elevator, going up, going down. That was innocent. But this Bare Naked Lady thing, I don't know where we came up with this idea, but the bathroom was like an apartment in our mind, and the one person would be in the bathroom and be naked. and was like you were like a person, and the doorbell rang, and the other person was the person at the door, and the bare naked person would open up the bathroom door, and the person on the other side would go, "Oh, bare naked lady," and then we'd laugh.
Sounds creepy.
It does sound creepy, and there was some sexual stuff.
He's an interesting person. I think I've told you the story because his dad ran a restaurant in Santa Maria called what, Mom?
Tacos?
No.
I'm sorry, what?
What was the name of the Ostini restaurant out in Casmalia?
Oh, the Hitching Post.
The Hitching Post. His dad started the Hitching Post. And Billy took it over after his dad died, Billy and his brother, and then they made another Hitching Post. They built another one in Solvang. Buellton, yeah, Solvang, Buellton area. And that was their second one. Terry ran the Buellton Hitching Post, and Billy, to my knowledge, Billy or his kids still run the one in Casmalia, which was a small town, maybe 10 miles outside Santa Maria.
Who was the one who ran it in Buellton?
Terry.
And he was, and that's where a large amount of the film Sideways was filmed.
Correct.
You can see in the restaurant, I think Terry or maybe his son speaking with the director and the actors, Paul Giamatti, Thomas Hayden Church, all together.
I think they used Terry in the film. He was the guy who ran the restaurant,
behind the bar.
I think, yeah. So the Ostinis were interesting people. I remember Billy going over to his house, a memory that he loved to eat what he called mayo sandwiches, which was literally just 2 pieces of bread with a whole bunch of mayo in between. And that was Billy's big treat and snack, which gives you an insight why Billy ended up so large. But
anything else going on?
No, nothing else going on. You could even ask Donna. But it's a good thing our brothers never got wind of that at that age. They would have really. But another thing we'd always say, we said it all the time, was when I grew up, I called a butt a bobo. I don't know why. Maybe butt sounded like bobo to me. So we thought we were being really nasty, and we'd run down the street saying, "Poo-poo in the pants, white bobo." Why we thought that was funny, I don't know. You can ask, Tom still remembers it. Uncle Tom still remembers us doing that.
Donnie Johnson was perhaps my rival at that age. He was bigger than most kids and bigger than me at the time, although we were the same age. And he was very athletic. His dad was named Smokey, nickname, and he was the baseball ringleader for Santa Maria, one of them at the time, instrumental in the Little League of Santa Maria and that type. And Donnie got his athleticism from his dad, I'm sure. But he and I butted heads because he was the toughest and the strongest of the Santa Maria group, but for me. And we fought a few times, and we played a lot and always competed against each other.
We'd say it like this: "Poo-poo in the pants, white bobo."
White or white?
White.
White bobo.
Bobo, because I guess, back then there was a big billboard for Coppertone that I don't think they could do this nowadays. It showed a little girl in a bathing suit on the beach.
Well, the Coppertone baby, the dog pulling down.
And the dog pulling down her bottom of her bathing suit. And you could see a little bit of her white butt because it was showing that the Coppertone made her tan. And then, the white butt. And so, maybe that was it. Poo-poo in the pants, white bobo. But we'd say it sing-songy like that. Poo-poo in the pants, white bobo. Poo-poo in the pants, white bobo. I think we did anything to shock people. To shock our brothers, especially. We were both the youngest. She had one older brother, I had 2 older brothers. And her brother, Gary, was right between Tom and Jim's age.
He grew up and ended up being a minister. Mom and I ran into him at a grocery mart in Santa Maria one time, and he had recognized me apparently. I didn't even recognize him, but he never grew after the 8th grade. He stayed the same size and was actually rather short for a high school or post-high school age. and he was about the same age, and he became a minister. That's what I recall him telling us. Is that right, Mama?
I'm sorry, I wasn't listening.
In any case, that was Donnie Johnson.
So that was when you were kids, and as you grew up and went into teenage, you're still very close?
Very close. In fact, she's the one who first gave me the name Louise, because she couldn't say Louise. When I first met her, I was 3, or that I remember meeting her, because you can see from the one picture I was a baby when all we cousins were together in New York. But the first time I remember her, I was 3 and she was 5.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing I do, we had such good times, and when we were a little older and lived in Southern California, we go to, of course, Disneyland. That was always one of our day trips, or and we went so every summer that we had it down pat what we like to do. We got to a certain age where we didn't have to hang with our parents all day. We had to meet up with them for meals, and so we had certain things we did every time. We like a routine of what we did. Not only the rides, but things we ate. We always had Welch's grape drink. There used to be a Welch's grape stand in Fantasyland. We always have that grape, not grapefruit, but grape. What do you call it? Grape drink. Regular
Juice.
Grape juice. The Welch's grape juice. We always had that. We always bought penny candy. They used to have penny candy on Main Street.
Right.
We always buy that to take home with
Now
us.
it's, I think, like $10 candy.
Yeah. Probably more than that now. And what else did we get? We got the orange juice bar, frozen bar from the little people who sold it. That was one of our. And then, of course, we had to meet our parents for lunch and dinner. And we always ate at like the Plaza or something like that. And as soon as we were done eating, we couldn't wait to go on our own.
Donnie, I could, even though he was a good fighter, he knew a lot of fighting moves and tricky little moves. I could whoop him, and after the first time I whooped him, we really didn't fight anymore. We butted heads in sports and competed that way. He was always the star of the other team, and I was the star of the one team. Like, for instance, he went to that elementary school, Robert Bruce, and I went to St. Mary's, and we competed against each other in softball and flag football and biddy basketball, and we always competed that way.
Our parents didn't ride a lot of rides, so they would give us, that was when you had to have a ticket to get on a ride. It was either A, B, C, D, or E. E was the best rides, of course, most expensive, and A was like the trolley car going up and down Main Street.
Mm-hmm.
But in Fantasyland there was a lot of C rides. Peter Pan, Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, the Teacups.
C, letter C.
C.
Yeah.
And so our parents never went on those rides, so they'd always, when we met up, like especially at lunch, we'd say, "Can we have your C tickets?" And they'd rip them out of the book and give them to us. And so we had extra C tickets for all those rides. We weren't big on the roller coasters yet.
You have a funny story, though, about going on the Matterhorn with your father, I recall.
Oh, yes. Because like I said, when we were younger, Donna and I never wanted to go on those fast rides. Like, I guess in those days, the Matterhorn was the only...
Right, Space Mountain hadn't been built yet. Splash Mountain wasn't
No.
built yet. I don't think there was even a Thunder Mountain yet.
No. There was none of that. So what happened was my other cousins from Boston came out for the summer. Paula, Karen, and David. Karen, Paula, and David, I should say, age-wise. And they wanted to go on the Matterhorn. And I was like, "I've never been on it." "You've never been on it?" "Oh, come on, let's go." So sort of peer pressure. And I went on, and I remember standing in line saying, "I can't believe I'm doing this. I can't believe I'm doing it." And then when I went on it, it wasn't that bad. So I liked it then. And then when Donna came the next time, I said, I went on the Matterhorn with Karen and Paul and David. We got to go. So she said, "Okay."
You know, listening to your stories and how you would, break out of the house at night, sneak out, how this group of friends would go off and do everything, it sort of invokes in my mind an image of the movie Stand By Me, based on the Stephen King book The Body.
Yes.
Is it similar?
The similarities are remarkable between my youth and that, but yes, very much. The towns were the same, the adventures were the same. Jimmy Ordell, Oliver, and I actually found a dead body and took our friends out to see it before we reported it to the police. It was floating in a reservoir and outside of Santa Maria, where we were exploring once, and we pulled it to shore and called friends to see it, then eventually called the police to let them know, or told our parents finally. But yeah, we're that kind of group, and we were always doing adventurous stuff.
So we went on it. We went on it so much, especially we knew the park closed at 1 a.m. in those days. We knew if you went any time after midnight, there was no line, because most people had gone home. So we'd go on a bunch of times. And one time we went on, and one of in those days they were like double seats, and for the weight part of it, you'd have to have both seats filled, and so we'd have to sit together. So they put an employee on with us because it was like the last ride of the night.
Oh.
And the employee said to us, if you lean with the car, it'll go faster, because there'd be no friction, because it was all, oh, really? Cool. So we started, every time we went around a curve, we'd lean with it, so we could go really...
Don't hurt yourself.
So we could go really fast and everything. So I got to the point where I really loved it. Well, we were at Disneyland once when Donna wasn't there, and my grandmother was visiting, as a matter of fact. And I wanted to go on the Matterhorn, and no one else wanted to go with me. In fact, I take that back. It wasn't my grandmother, because my grandmother did go on the Matterhorn. It was her sister, my great aunt Dale, who was staying with us, and she wouldn't go on it. And of course, my mother never went on those rides, and so I wanted to go on. And halfway through the ride, I hear him say, "Oh Lord, please get me down safely, and I promise I'll never go on this ride again." He actually was praying up there. It was funny, it cracked me up. But yeah, so we liked those rides when we were a little older.
Now, it's not Richard Dreyfuss narrating this, but what was your experience when you first saw that was the first dead body you've ever seen?
Yes. Yeah,
I assume.
It was exciting. And the other similarities is, I believe Richard Dreyfuss turned out to be an attorney.
No, it was the other.
Oh, the other boy,
played by River Phoenix.
Right, and that's who I related to, because his role in the group of guys was basically my role as well.
Richard Dreyfuss's voice he was narrating for the boy played by Will Wheaton at that time.
That's right.
So, and then there was a fat kid who ended up marrying Rebecca Romaine. And, but you related mostly to the...
I related to the town, to
River
River Phoenix, and to the adventure. Yeah.
Before we could drive, our big thing one summer was playing miniature golf. We got so hooked on miniature golf, and it wasn't that much to play in those days, maybe 50 cents. And we kept asking our parents, for money, and finally my Aunt Eunice said, well, you're going to have to earn the money. So in those days, men always wore dress shirts, even, collared shirts, even every day. You didn't see guys too much in, well, you saw them in t-shirts occasionally, but if they were hanging around the house, but if they were going to any kind of job at all, they wore a collared shirt. So we had 5 men in the house during the summer that all were wearing shirts, and they had to be washed and ironed. Everything had to be ironed in those days. So we ironed shirts for money, Donna and I. And I got so good at it that's the job that my mother gave to me later on. That's another funny story. She was bragging about me once, and she said, she ironed shirts even better than I do. And Tom said, that's because you used to have to heat your iron up on the stove. Aging her more than she really was. But anyway, I think part of it was the miniature golf, and the other part was just doing something away from our parents, because we weren't old enough to drive yet. And it was just a way to get away from everybody and do our thing.
And Pat Mahoney, did you talk about?
He's a parochial schoolmate. I had some two separate group of friends, and one from my neighborhood, one from the parochial school, and he was one of the ones I was closest with from parochial school. We didn't live near each other, but we played a lot and hung around a lot at the parochial school. He also came from a farming family.
But one thing I remember about Donna is she was an avid reader, just a really avid reader. She probably still is. And she read all the Nancy Drew books. So we would buy that penny candy when we were at Disneyland. Of course, we wouldn't eat it while we were at Disneyland, but we'd take it home, and when we got in bed at night, we'd eat the candy, especially those little dot things that are on paper. Do you know what I'm talking about? They're like, it looks like maybe a receipt, it's a long piece of paper like that, and there's
roll up?
No, and there's a dot here, a dot there, a dot here, a dot there, and you pick the dot off and eat it.
I don't know what you're talking.
If I ever see them, I'll show them to you, or I'll mail you some. Because every once in a while I see them somewhere, like one of those
gas stations.
No, specialty candy stores. Where you have to weigh your candy and pay for it. Now it costs like $50 for a little bit of candy. I remember those in particular because I can still picture Donna telling me stories and picking those off and eating them while she's telling the story.
Santa Maria at that time was almost exclusively farms or ranch. They had a geographical situation where the riverbed, Santa Maria River, deposited in the Santa Maria Valley all the minerals, and so it was a very rich, and still is, rich, fertile area. It's called the broccoli capital of the world, or at least United States, because of all the broccoli and strawberries.
So what she would do is she would tell me stories, and she would take these Nancy Drew books that she had read, and she'd take parts of, and she would more or less tell me the stories. But I thought she was just making these all up. I thought she was the best storyteller ever, because they were all these mysteries, about this and that. That was, and then we bought those beads at Disneyland that now they have that stuff that automatically lights up. You see the kids wearing the necklaces. You had stuff like that too. But back then they had those kind of beads, but you had to either put them in the sunlight or put them on a lamp, to get
the phosphorus.
Right, and then they glow. And so we put them on this lamp one time, and we had them on there too long, and they melted into the lamp. I'll never forget that. We did dumb stuff like that, but we were pretty good kids.
One of my earliest employment was picking strawberries with Ordell. I must have been maybe 11 or 12 when we went out to the field and started picking strawberries, and you get paid for how many boxes that you could fill up at the end of the day. And the immigrant workers, we'd work side by side by them, and Ordell and I lasted maybe, I think, a day and a half. The first day we ended up with, I think, maybe 3-4 trays of strawberries between us. Most of them we ate before we got it, and we both got sick at home later that night, where the actual migrant workers would turn in 20 to 30 boxes. We came in combined with 3 or 4, so it wasn't profitable for us. We were getting sick, and we quit our halfway through the second day.
You're probably eating strawberries laced with pesticide that hadn't been washed off yet.
No doubt.
We got along, her and I got along really well, because we liked the same things, and we thought the same way, and we loved to go in swimming, and we try to talk underwater. That was really fun. We'd play this game where we'd go underwater and hold hands and face each other and say something, and then we'd come up and try to guess what the other person had said. And that was just fun to us. And then when our many trips to Vegas, like I said, when we played Bare Naked Lady and Elevator and stuff like that, my parents stayed in this dive called the Paradise Inn. It had, I think it's still there, or at least it was several years ago, because Papa and I drove by. It had 2 dice up in the air, so it was a play on words, paradise and pair of dice. And but it was a small motel, and they had kitchenettes in them, and we got adjoining rooms. And so in the morning, the mothers would get up and fix us a little bowl of cereal. They had those little boxes, cereal, and we'd have cereal. And Donna and I's big thing was we couldn't wait to go swimming, couldn't wait to go. And they had a little pool there and stuff. They had one of those Coke machines where you had to put the coin in and then take the Coke and go like through a maze to get it out and pull it up.
No.
I've seen pictures of that on Facebook recently. Like, does anybody remember these? And stuff like that. But and then they drag us to the Sahara for brunch, for the buffet brunch, because in those days the kids ate free, and it was only like $1 for the parents. Food was really cheap in Vegas before the corporations took it over from the mob. The mob kept the prices down, so they could feed all of us for nothing practically.
Right. Well, Uncle Orty was perhaps my closest boyhood friend. He lived on Bunny, which was 3 blocks away from my house, and we got together mainly because the neighborhood kids hung out. But he always was my closest friend because he'd always go along with whatever I wanted to do. He was very passive, and if I said let's go to the movie, he said fine. You want to go pick strawberries? Fine. So I think we gravitated to each other that way, similar to the way Mom was with Darlene in her college career. But Jimmy was a good guy, a good friend, and a very good athlete, even though he didn't know his potential. He was very strong. He was one of those kids that had innate strength, where when we were in high school we'd be lifting weights and everything, and Jimmy wouldn't lift at all. He's still stronger than any of us. But he remained my friend throughout high school, probably one of my closest friends. And as you are aware, he moved to Colorado eventually and suffered from alcohol disease.
We'll get into that later, yeah.
Okay. The thing I remember about that is we couldn't wait to get back to our hotel to go swimming, and they would sit and have more coffee and talk and talk and talk, and then we'd say, can we go out and look at the pool? Okay, go look at the pool. And we go out there, and of course that Paradise Inn where we stay was this little dinky pool, and here was the Sahara with this big Olympic-sized pool, and we'd be like, oh, it was so hot outside because it was always the summer. And then they take us back to our hotel, and then we'd swim, and they'd take turns watching us and whatever. One time I remember, it was after breakfast, and we said, we want to go swimming, and they said, okay, we'll wait for whichever one. It was Aunt Eunice that was going to watch us that morning. She said she had to get dressed first.
A person named Eunice.
Yeah. And we said, we want to go down to the pool right now. No, you have to wait for me. Oh, we'll go down, but we won't go in the water till you get there. Okay, that's okay. Go down to the pool, but don't go in the water till I get there. So we thought we'd be cute, and we went and hid in the bathroom. We got in so much trouble because we scared the jeebies out of him. First, Eunice came down and we were gone, and she went running back to the room and got my mom, and they both came running down there. And then we jumped out and said, surprise! Oh, they didn't think it was funny at all. They were so pissed at us. I don't think we were allowed to swim that whole day. And then another thing we did was we walked over to this little cafe, and we get pie, and I always got banana cream pie. Oh, it was so good. I don't remember what Donna got, but it was dumb things like that you remember.
Uncle Huey was a boyhood friend also. He lived maybe half a block from Ordell and maybe a block and a half from me, and he hung with us, but he was 2 years younger, and so he was on the periphery of our community gang, if you want to call it a gang. He wasn't good enough to play in the sports that we always participated in, but he always enjoyed sports, and he was around, and he had a unique body that looked like, at the time, a cartoon character, Huey the Duck.
Baby Huey.
Baby Huey the Duck. So we called him Baby Huey. That was his nickname. And although
that was because
his legs were very short, just like the cartoon character, and he was long-waisted, long on the top torso part of his body, but short legs. So he became Baby Huey. But again, we weren't that close, and he had his own set of friends his age that he always played with as well. I just recall him being on the periphery of our gang and wanting to play with us in sports, but not often participating. As he got older, we became closer, and he grew up, so we decided to drop the name Baby, or I decided, and just called him Huey, and he's always been Huey to me.
Mm-hmm.
So, when we were, I believe, 13 and 15, by then my brothers weren't going to Vegas with us anymore. It was just Donna and me and my parents, our parents. And we were old enough to leave alone sometimes for like swimming purposes and whatever. So we got to the point, we went to a couple of shows with our parents. We saw like Johnny Carson, Don Rickles, and then we were like, we're tired of all these shows. We don't want to go to any shows. Can we eat by ourselves? Can we just go to the coffee shop? Sure. So then they gave us that leeway where we didn't have to go to dinner with them. We could go have dinner at the coffee shop. And every night we ate French onion soup followed by hot fudge sundaes.
I want to backtrack. So your parents were taking you to see young Johnny Carson perform and eat dinner at the same time, and then
yeah, you know, one of those shows where you had dinner and
Yeah.
you saw the thing, and you know, it was okay the first couple times, but
you were too young for it.
Yeah, we were. I remember Bob Newhart in particular.
Ah.
He was the funniest of all of them, I thought, and his humor was a little on the sick side, not dirty, but sick.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I remember some joke about a bird squishing a bird or something. I don't remember now, but we had seen enough, so we said, you know, from the year before and stuff, and then they started it again, and we said, you know, we're not really interested in that. We saw Johnny Carson, Don Rickles, and Bob Newhart, Edie Gourmet, and we could go have dinner at the coffee shop. French onion soup followed by hot fudge sundaes. We saw Johnny Carson, Don Rickles, and Bob Newhart, Edie Gourmet, and French onion soup followed by hot fudge sundaes. French onion soup followed by hot fudge sundaes. And every night we ate French onion soup followed by hot fudge sundaes. Every night. The food was all this, too much food for us. We didn't want that much food. Soup and hot fudge sundae was enough for us.
Mm-hmm. And you and he would play a lot of basketball. Artie and Huey and you would play a lot of basketball together. That was more in high school, or did that start in grade school?
Yeah, actually, Huey, still being 2 years younger than Artie and I, didn't really play a lot of sports with him. I remember in high school he was the equipment manager, I think, for the basketball team or the football team. And when we were growing up on my house on Thornburg, it was Jimmy and I playing basketball on a court that my grandfather made for me in my backyard, a small half court. But and Jimmy and I would go over to the local elementary, junior high school, El Camino, and play baseball. And of course, all the community kids would play baseball together. Baseball was the big sport back then.
But that's when I first jumped off a high dive.
Ah, yes, I remember this story.
Yeah. But so I said, let's go off that high dive. Oh, really? I'll go if you go. And so the first time we
Was
went,
Uncle Tom there?
Yes, this time Uncle Tom was there. He was the only sibling there. And
That's how I first heard about this story.
yes. And so we go up the high dive, and she jumps off, and I chicken out. She got really mad at me, so I said, okay, I'll do it. This is because I have that, I don't like that feeling of falling. I used to always have nightmares about it, and I don't like Splash Mountain where you have to, I don't like that. I don't like that falling feeling. So I jumped off the high dive and I screamed all the way down without wanting to. It was like I could not do it. So then it was like, oh my gosh, the lifeguards looking and everything. So I said, I got to be able to do this without screaming. So I tried it 2 more times.
I'm not going to scream. I'm not going to scream.
I'm not going to scream. Screamed all the way down. And the funny thing was I was trying to get my mom, who was sitting in the shallow end jabber-jawing with somebody, to look at me. Watch. So irritating. But
Good thing you're nothing like that.
I'm nothing like that. So then I said, my brother was over at the other pool because they had more than one pool. That was the other thing that was so cool. Tom, come over here. I want you to watch me jump off the high dive. And when that was the 3rd time down, and I screamed once again, he just turned and walked away, pretended like he didn't know who I was. But Don and I's favorite thing was, besides the pool and eating in that cafe, was to hang out in the room, and we played like Crazy Eights and games like that. But we had good times.
Mm-hmm.
We had simple pleasures. Let's put it that way. We never had to do anything too wild or crazy.